Thank you for being here. I want to start with a few thanks to the organizers, Reiko-san, Kanda-san. It was a very nice talk that we had a few years ago when I left Tokyo to go back to the Sorbonne University as a full research professor there, that we should organize something again after what we had already done. For example, in 2022, on the future of liberalism, 自由主義の未来についての会議. So we had a few experiences already with NERA, and so we decided that we would make this possible. And it became possible since we are here today, and you are here as well. So thank you for being here. The other person I have to thank is Adrienne, my colleague. 立派な学者ですね。それでいい協力者ですよ。And thanks to her, we are doing good work. Now that I said the origins of the conference, I should also say the contents of it. How to act responsibly. I will say that shortly in 3 words. Responsibility, 自己責任, but the term might be a little wrongly interpreted. Let's say, 自助、共助、公助. This is what it is about. Then, choice. Not so much when you have to make a choice between different things. 選択. 1, 2, こっち、どっち. But the decision moment, the decision making. 決定. That is the second term that I want to underscore. And then the third one will be coordination, cooperation, 協力, because none of that is possible without coordinating the efforts of people of goodwill. Now, how to act responsibly requires that those 3 elements be put together. Why? Well, because we are all human beings, and we all have different needs. Satisfying them is a condition for us to exist, whatever the context in our personal or social, national or international life. To act, we have received faculties, we have abilities, personal abilities. Those are different for each one of us. And therefore, each one has the responsibility of his own existence. This is a heavy responsibility. It is also a natural responsibility. And it goes together with the necessity of exercising it freely. So the point for those 3 elements, yeah, 責任 or 自助、共助、公助, 選択、決定, and 協力 is that freedom be guaranteed. This is why freedom and responsibility go together. We may sometimes have the impression that they will be separate in some way, because if you leave people free to do something, they might act irresponsibly. And we, thinkers, let's say lawyers, economists, politicians, sociologists, geographers as well, we all have this task of being the responsible people, as they say in English is not my first language, neither is Japanese, as they say, the adults in the room. This is a heavy responsibility. For example, when it comes to exchanging goods, to making trade. Free trade and responsibility go together, because trade, when it is free, it is grounded on solid economic theories. Theories of comparative advantages, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so on, until the theories of today, Heckscher, Orlin, and others. And responsibility requires that the traders, through contracting, through law acceptance through good practices be always present to the minds of the traders. If you are doing business, being responsible is necessary to you. So it is to the managers and even to the public governors. If they forget it, then it is in the end of the traders and in the end of the thinkers to be responsible for them. That's the first point. The second is that this responsibility has been elaborated in the history, especially in Europe. Europe has been the prime source of those ideas that I mentioned. Responsibility, choice, coordination, make good governance. From there, the West has developed two other continents, but Europe is the source, the origin, and places that develop differently than Europe, like here in Japan, have their own system of understanding. I said Jijo, Kyojo, Kojo. We wrote a paper with Adrienne on this topic that was published by the British Association for Japanese Studies in Japan Forum. So how to act responsibly implies that we take into account those different civilizations. And then, I will shortly finish on that, then one has to coordinate those different places, those different understandings, and this is what we're doing here in the conference. Exchanging ideas is part of our duty. It's not the job only. It's not making possible to get a salary. It's a duty to understand and to work for our countries to be able to cooperate. It's not planning just for oneself, but it's also planning how we will go together. And who is planning that? It shouldn't be the few, it should be all. And this is why ideas, being universal, are helpful to all. Now, I will have too many things to say about the ideas. I should stop. But I thank you again for your attention. Now, Adrienne will introduce our three speakers for panel one. And you have the floor, Adrienne.
Thank you. So, thank you very much, Gilles CAMPAGNOLO. So this panel brings together three excellent researchers to explore responsibility at both practical and theoretical levels. We will first listen to Raphaël Languillon. His presentation is titled Climate Responsibility and Local Planning. Raphaël Languillon is researcher at the French Research Institute on Japan at the Maison Franco-Japonaise, and he's also associate researcher at the University of Genova. He conducts research in geography and urban planning, following a critical political economy approach. The second speaker, I'm very glad to introduce you to Kanako Takae. She will present on Beyond Anthropocentrism, Rethinking Ethical Framework for the Future. Kanako Takae is a researcher associate at the Institute for Advanced Social Science at Waseda University, and she works on applied ethics and analytic philosophy. Last but not least, I'm very glad to present you Marie-Elif from Paris Panthéon-Assas University, where she is associate professor in law, specialized in civil law and insurance law. She will talk today about the liability of company, questioning if it is a solution to humanitarian disaster. So thank you to all of three. And Raphaël Languillon, the floor is yours.
Okay. So thank you, Gilles, and thank you, Adrienne, for your introduction. And thank you I want to thank the NIRA for organizing this event, and of course the audience. You are quite numerous today. So as Adrienne told you, I'm a research officer at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mandate at the French Research Institute on the Maison Franco-Japonaise in Ebisu. I'm also a associate researcher at the University of Geneva in Switzerland and University of Strasbourg in France. And today I want to deal with climate responsibility and local planning, as I am an urban planner. So the PowerPoint disappeared. Maybe it's going to come back in a few minutes. Just to say that I'm a geographer, urban planner, specializing in a critical political economy of planning. Yes. Okay. So the slide doesn't change. Does it work? Can you switch the slides to the next one? Is it possible to do it? Okay.
Having some minor technical difficulties. If you can just hold on a second.
Okay.
Our apologies.
Okay. Thank you. That one. I'm a geographer specializing in the critical political economy of planning, and my general research is about the relationships between political regimes, economic regimes, and urbanization dynamics. So we can shift to the next slide, please. I'm working now at the French Research Institute on Japan in Ebisu, which belongs to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research in France. And actually, we have a couple of facilities there. Some of them I know that you have already been there. I really thank for your assiduity. And we have also a library, which is the biggest library in French in whole Pacific Asia. So I really encourage you to have a look and come visit us one time. So next slide, please. Yes, so briefly, the content of my presentation today in 3 parts. First, the principle of responsibility in planning, then a few contextualization about the Anthropocene studies, which I called the Anthropocene hypothesis, right? And then the relationship between space and planning in Anthropocene era. So next slide. Okay, so the point is that talking about responsibility in planning, it's not very common because there is no academic work on responsibility in planning or of planning or and planning. Yet responsibility is at the heart of the planning principles and the planning goals, planning activity. At least we can identify 3 sets of responsibility in planning. First, the moral responsibility of the state and the different levels of public authorities. Right? And moral responsibility of the state and the public authorities, at least at 3 levels. First, to equip national and local territories and create wealth, which is the main goal of the planning state, right? Then protect vulnerable areas and populations, when you want to protect natural resources, for example, like forests, mountains, or coastal, and so on. And then when you want to equitably distribute wealth and services across the countries or across local territories, right? It's related to spatial justice of planning. And this is also related to responsibility of the public authority, including the states and local bodies. Secondly, we have, as individuals or as moral individuals, legal and even sometimes criminal responsibility in planning, especially via the principles of ownership and use of land and real estate. If you are the owner of your own house, for example, you are responsible of the dysfunctioning of the house. You are responsible of the maintenance of the building as a real estate developer, and so on. And this is related to responsibility in planning. And lastly, in a post-welfare state regime, individuals have the responsibility of becoming owner of their own housing unit, because whatever happens in your life, you will be able to sell your house to face the difficulties. And in the post-welfare regime, it's called the asset-based welfare regime, and it's very important. And it's related to the individual responsibility towards anything what can happen in your life, right, as a security. So next slide, please. So now we have seen that responsibility is deeply involved in planning. at different levels, we can also see that planning has a huge responsibility towards climate change, especially through urban sprawl and the artificialization of territories. You have here one example in France. It's a huge urban sprawl eating land on agricultural, forestry, and natural resources. And as you can see on the graph on the back, housing is, they said, sectors responsible of land artificialization. So in the different reports we have, in the different law we have, we think that there is a responsibility behind land artificialization. And this responsibility belongs to either the people, individuals, but also the local authorities, public authorities, national government, and the people making laws, especially urban planning laws. Next slide, please. And we have measured the artificialization speed in France, decades per decades. From 2009 to 2019, we have more than 2,007 square kilometers of newly artificialized land in our country, and 2/3 is due to housing, right? So the individuals' needs for housing, right? And that next slide, this strong speed of artificialization is not due to main cities, is due to rural and peripheral local authorities. Especially, we have measured that half of the artificialization happens or occurs in local municipalities that count for less than 2,000 people, meaning that it's really rural areas that are responsible for half of the artificialization today. But back to the past, of course, main cities' territory, usually artificialized spaces, was before natural agricultural or forestry land, right? So the responsibility of nowadays artificialization shouldn't occur or hide the past responsibility of other space and local authorities in past artificialization, right? So responsibility in planning is also a question of time, okay? So next slide, please. And based on that observation, we issue, when I say we, it's the French government, we issue in France a new law in 2021 called Climate and Resilience Law, which make a strong link, a strong relation between artificialization of land by planning and global warming, climate change. Because when you artificialize land, you destruct ecosystems, but you also release CO2, carbons in the atmosphere, right? So if you want to tackle climate change, you have to change the way you plan local territories, and you have to completely shift from sprawl to compacification of planning based on the responsibility, the past responsibility of planning toward climate change through land artificialization. So next slide, please. This is few contribution in English. I want to skip this slide because we don't have time due to the technical problem. And next slide is about the second part of the presentation, the Anthropocene hypothesis. So I know that you know the work of Saito Kohei, right, from the University of Tokyo. He used the Anthropocene studies in a Marxist or neo-Marxist perspective, right? It's not really my point today, but just to give you few details, few elements, few contextualization about the Anthropocene hypothesis. It's formalized in the 2000 by two people, Paul-Joseph Crutzen and Eugène Stromer. And Anthropocene means the era of man, which is a little bit narcissistic, right? And it's based on the fact that humanity acquired an unprecedented capacity for action on the biosphere, with human beings having become a major geological force able to leave their mark on the lithosphere, meaning on the deep geological structure of Earth. So next slide, please. So we have two definitions of the inflection point between the so-called Holocene, the era before Anthropocene, and the supposedly new era called Anthropocene. We have a geological definition of that by the identification of a global stratotype point in the ground, right, at the lithospheric level. And we have a more recent definition of this inflection between Holocene and Anthropocene, a bioecosystemic definition through the observation of an eradication of most of the refuges from which different species can be reconstituted after major events. And when I say major events, I am speaking of extinction, right? So next slide. In detail, because Anthropocene is not just related to time, but also to space, but also to time. We have different sub-periods of the Anthropocene. It's deal with a lot of different debates. A first period is the modern period, which is also the colonialistic period, when the first industrial revolution began, which would have allowed humanity a first step in his ability to transform the geological layers of the planet. Then a second period is the entry into the nuclear age, identifiable by the deposit of radioactive isotopes in the superficial lithospheric layers. And it's going to stay in the ground not just for decades, but for millions and millions of years. So it has literally a geological identity, which will last for a long period of time. And the last period, the contemporary period, called the Great Acceleration, marked by curves of anthropogenic impacts of the exponential type on the environmental, the climate, and the planet. And we have 4 major Anthropocene mutations we can observe. Global warming is just one of them, but we have also the biodiversity crisis, the resource depletion, and the change in the metabolism of biotic systems. I don't have time to enter into details. And next slide is about my third point in this presentation, the relation between space and planning in Anthropocene era. The main relation between space and planning is related to capitalism as a regime. Capitalism is defined as an economic system based on the production of goods for profits through the exploitation of wage labor and the free appropriation of natural forces. So the relation with space and nature is quite obvious. And in neo-Marxist works, not Saito Kore, but from David Harvey work, the relation between space and capitalism is due to the notion of spatial fix. I don't have time to deal with that, but maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A session. And the literature emphasizes on the role of inequalities, the relation of domination, and the regime of exploitation of space in the emergence of the Anthropocene. And we have two, at the same time, continuity and a very critical notion towards Anthropocene, which arose in the past year, the Capitalocene, based on the notion of capitalism, and the Plantationocene, which is related to post-colonial studies. I don't have time to enter in that point. The last slide is about what I want to end my presentation with. The relation between space and planning at the Anthropocene era, in my opinion, is strongly related to urbanization, right? With that hypothesis of the Anthropocene city, which is a French hypothesis. I know that there is also work in the North America and the rest of Europe, but the Anthropocene city is not a question of contextualization. It's not a question of time. It's not the city during the Anthropocene era. It's different. It's the Anthropocene city is the idea that urbanization is the main factor of the world's shift into the Anthropocene era. So Anthropocene era is about, it's all about urbanization of the world. And there is a link between global urbanization and the four major Anthropocene transformations I was talking about, including global warming. So when we talk about responsibility and Anthropocene city, we talk about the responsibility of the cities and worldwide urbanization. So next slide is about conclusion. What research agenda based on those few elements? First, the spatial drivers of the principle of responsibility is one of the two axes I want to develop. Is responsibility a spatial notion? I do believe it is. Is responsibility something that could be spatializable, right? And the second axis is the principle of responsibility in the dynamics of regional planning. In France, in Japan, Europe, Asia, what kind of influence does the principle of responsibility have on planning procedures, laws, planning regimes, and also form of plannings? For example, compact city may be one of the answer of that point, the responsible planning towards climate change and so on. So thank you for your attention. It was my last slide. Last slide. Next slide is about, yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raphaël, for your beautiful presentation. You explain very well the multifaceted of responsibility of the state, local government, and the individuals in relation to urban planning and climate change. You managed to relate it to Anthropocene, capitalism, while introducing world urbanization process. So I'm sure we'll have many questions. And last, maybe you have, Gilles, you want to add something?
Questions will be at the end of the 3 talks, but I abuse my position, of course. You mentioned responsibility and planning. You referred to our colleague from Todai, Saito Kohei. I always have the question for him as a neo-Marxist, that is, who plans for whom? That's the only question that I have. I want to mention that Raphaël has been contributing to an issue of the review of economic philosophy on justice, interest, and judicialization that Adrienne and I have coordinated. And that's both in English and in French. And this is wonderful to explain even more his views. Here he got only 15 minutes. There he got 45 pages. And I think this is worth it. The journal, I have a few copies here for people who are interested to know what it is about. Economic philosophy. 経済哲学の雑誌の特集号をどうぞ。本当に。Thank you for your attention. And now we'll listen to the second talk by高江可奈子さん from Waseda.
Okay, so my name is Kanako Takae, a researcher at Waseda University. I'm delighted to join this conference as part of the International Research Network on Responsibility, Choice, and Coordination. My specialty is applied ethics, so in this presentation, I will explore a relationship between law and ethics through the critique of anthropocentrism. Sorry, next slide. Anthropocentrism, it's in Japanese, 人間中心主義, which is similar to Anthropocene, Shinjise, that Raphael talked about in his presentation, but anthropocentrism in my talk is more on ethical, nuanced concept. And so in this presentation, I critically examined the limitations of current legal responses to ethical critiques of anthropocentrism developed in the fields of animal ethics and environmental ethics, limitations rooted in the law's dualistic framework of persons and things. I then explore how legal personhood when reconceptualized relationally, can serve as a tool for transformative legal innovation. And here's the chapters of the presentation. Next slide, please. So traditional ethical systems have centered on human interests, treating non-human beings, both animals and nature, as mere resources or property. This anthropocentric perspective is exemplified in Kantian ethics, which draws a sharp boundary between humans and all other beings. Next, please. Society has largely aligned with this anthropocentric perspective until significant shifts began to emerge around the 1960s. First, growing moral concern for animal welfare gained traction, particularly in response to the rise of factory farming, kojo chikusan. Ruth Harrison's influential book, Animal Machines, exposed the deplorable conditions in which animals were kept, sparking public outcry. Next, please. Around the same time, environmental degradation came to be recognized as a serious social issue. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring drew attention to the ecological crisis, raising widespread awareness about the urgency of addressing environmental harm. Next, please. In response to these social or societal changes, academic scholars in ethics began to challenge anthropocentrism. In animal ethics, Peter Singer argued that anthropocentrism manifests as speciesism, 種差別, an unjustified privileging of human interests over those of other sentient beings. He advocates for the equal consideration of interests based on sentience rather than species membership. In environmental ethics, Aldo Leopold called for extending ethical concerns to the entire land community, such as soils, waters, plants, and animals, not just humans. He emphasized ecological interdependence and redefined land not as property, but as a community to which we belong. Next, please. These ethical arguments have influenced public discourse and policy, leading to some legal responses. Animal welfare laws have been expanded in many jurisdictions, particularly in the EU and the UK. Likewise, climate-related legal actions and policy frameworks increasingly reflect ecological interdependence. However, these legal reforms remain limited. Factory farming is still legal and widespread globally, despite strong moral condemnations by leading ethicists. Fossil fuel expansion and deforestation continue to be legally permitted and even subsidized, despite ethical calls to respect ecological limits and the rights of future generations. Next, please. Will Kymlicka, a well-known Canadian political philosopher, describes the situation as an impasse, specifically relating to animal issues. Animals remain legally categorized as property, fundamentally limiting the scope of meaningful reform. Next, please. This reveals a persistent gap between ethics and law. Ethical arguments have challenged anthropocentrism by emphasizing the intrinsic value of non-human entities. That is, they possess value in themselves, not merely instrumental value for human ends. Such arguments call for the creation of a new moral category that transcends the traditional legal dichotomy between persons and things. However, this ethical vision has proven difficult to translate into legal frameworks, which remain grounded in this binary. Next, please. So what can be done in response to this predicament? I propose the need for legal innovation from within, specifically by focusing on the concept of legal personhood as a tool for recognizing non-human entities as more than mere property. A key example is the corporation, which holds legal personhood without being a natural person. Now, it's important to note that legal personhood is not equivalent to moral personhood. It can be granted for purely instrumental or functional legal purposes. In this sense, it may still operate within an anthropocentric framework. Next, please. But legal personhood has been applied to non-human entities in certain jurisdictions, such as rivers, parks, and non-human animals. And unlike ethical proposals that call for entirely new moral categories, legal personhood is an existing legal mechanism that holds potential for reform within the current system. As a flexible concept, I hope that it can open space beyond the rigid person-thing dichotomy, and in doing so, it offers a way to incorporate non-human perspectives into legal reasoning. Next, please. Yeah, next. Thank you. So with this in mind, let's take a look at some cases where legal personhood has been granted successfully and others where it has not. I found it particularly interesting that successful cases involve the attribution of legal personhood to natural entities like parks and rivers, whereas attempts to grant personhood to non-human animals have largely been unsuccessful. I'm going to just read out the each case. So successful cases, Urewera, formerly a national park, a sacred site for the tribe people, was granted a legal personhood to enable co-governance. Can you go back? Co-governance with the crown. And then the second case is Riva, recognized as an ancestor by, again, the tribe people. The river gained personhood with guardians, embedding indigenous cosmology into law. Okay, so let's move on to unsuccessful cases. Non-human rights project. So this project sought legal personhood for captive chimpanzees and elephants, arguing for their right to bodily liberty. And courts repeatedly rejected the claim, reasoning that animals cannot bear legal responsibilities and therefore do not qualify as legal persons. Chimpanzees and elephants, we are familiar with them, right? We share a lot of similarities, unlike rivers and park, but yet animal case continues to be largely unsuccessful, and I found it very interesting. This is so as I would intuitively expect it to be easier to recognize animals closer to humans as legal persons compared to landscapes and waterways. So next, please. So which leads me to this question. How does legal personhood function in successful and unsuccessful cases? And next, please. And here is a table showing the 4 types of legal personhood function in success. And here's a table showing the 4 types of legal personhood assigned in each of the 3 cases, along with how each type functions. Notice that the unsuccessful case represents the realist type, which shows in the red color. Sorry, I got lost. And the realist one is focusing on intrinsic value found in an entity. In contrast, successful cases fall under other categories, the symbolic or expressive type, which reflects societal or cultural values, and the fictional and functional instrumental types, which are not grounded in moral claims but serve practical legal purposes. Next slide, please. So based on this observation, I propose 2 key points. First, traditional ethical arguments for non-human entities have often focused on intrinsic value, grounded in individual capacities such as sentience, cognitive capacities, or autonomy. This framework creates a high threshold, restricting personhood to entities that closely resemble humans. Indeed, in the unsuccessful case, courts resisted this approach, viewing it as too morally demanding and legally unmanageable. This suggests that an individualistic framework of ethical arguments for personhood is unlikely to succeed in legal contexts. Instead, I propose shifting towards a relational framework. In particular, the symbolic or expressive type of legal personhood reflects a form of relational personhood, one constituted through ecological, cultural, or social relationships rather than individual traits. This approach is evident in the successful cases where personhood emerges from relational embeddedness rather than human-like individual capacities. Next, please. So, relational values and respect can ground symbolic, expressive, and/or fictional legal personhood, which can then be reflected in governance structures and institutionalized through functional or instrumental forms of personhood. Next, please. But what about modern liberal societies where dominant worldviews are individualistic and less symbolically rich? Can relational personhood still take hold in such contexts? Next, please. To this question, I propose that we need to reimagine non-human beings as relational subjects. Domesticated animals, for example, are not recognized as having cultural or social value beyond their functional or economic use in modern liberal societies. That's why we have factory farming, right? To extend relational personhood beyond indigenous and localized contexts that we find in successful cases, we need to reimagine them as relational subjects, being entirely constituted through human-shaped relationships of vulnerability. This reimagining allows us to see domesticated animals as embedded in a web of relationships involving production, care, and harm, and co-members of human-constructed environments such as homes, farms, and cities. And ethical arguments such as animal ethics and environmental ethics, but not only them, feminist ethics and disability studies even, because they have rich literatures on relational frameworks. These offer essential guidance for this shift. Next, please. So this shift would call for legal frameworks that acknowledge our obligation to protect and care for beings we have made vulnerable. Legal relational personhood then offers a way to reframe their status, shifting the legal focus from ownership to responsibility and care, and establishing legal constraints and systemic domination. And this provides a pathway beyond the narrative of property status. As Derrida Party argues, law can serve as a vehicle for ethical change, reorienting how society understands and values its relationship with the non-human others. Ethics and law together, therefore, can move us towards a framework of relational personhood, and this is part of our responsibility for our world today and for the future. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much for giving the talk. In ethics, it's like in economics, there are always choices that are made, assumed first, and that have to be explicited, to be made explicit. On the issue of non-human rights, this is also particularly important. So thank you for explaining that. The questions later can be asked in Japanese. Of course, this is a bilingual conference, no problem. I also mentioned that a colleague of yours, Clarisse Valmalette, gave us a non-humans and collective rights opportunity to clarify the concept of interest paper in this volume, in the special issue of the Journal of Economic Philosophy. And I want to mention that since you're also a new Japanese member of the International Research Network that I'll be heading, that was welcome. I was yesterday in Waseda presenting it. So that was great. Responsibility, choice, and coordination will be themes for us in the future. Now, I would have questions for you because I am in favor of methodological individualism. And I think that it does not exclude relational frames, that there is a way to understand that through especially the Austrian theory of economics. But that would be too long to discuss now. We'll have all the time during the 5 years of this program that I'll be heading, and I look forward to that. For now, please, Marie-Élise, for the next talk, the floor is yours.
皆さん、こんにちは。最初にはニラとカンパニョロ先生とサラ先生に感謝したいです。私にとって、 日本に帰ることは本当に嬉しいです。から、サラ先生、私に信じてくれてありがとうございます。だからみんな来てくれてありがとうございます。私の日本語は本当に悪いですから、今、英語で話しています。よろしくお願いします。So, thank you very much for coming to my presentation. I'm Marie Elif and I'm an assistant professor at Panthéon-Assas University, and I'm going to talk about the liability of the companies. You can switch to the next slide, please. Bhopal's chemical accident in 1984 was caused by an explosion at a pesticide factory belonging to a subsidiary of an American firm, which released 40 tons of methyl isocyanate into the city's atmosphere. The Erika is a Japanese-built oil tanker that sank in 1999 off the coast of Brittany, causing a gigantic oil spill. At the time, it belonged to a Maltese company and was chartered by Total to transport more than 30 tons of heavy fuel oil. Two of the most famous humanitarian catastrophes caused by a multinational firm. The legal reaction to those catastrophes is to seek for a liability. But in France and in general in all the Occidental-based laws, the common law of liability commands to prove the reunion of three conditions: a damage, a cause, and causality, a tort and causality. The damage is easily proven, but a quick study of the sociological theories of structural injustice shows that tort and causality are often lacking. Causality demands that the damage is directly caused by the tort of the company, which is hard to prove because precisely most of the time, as Young raised in her theories, there was no tort. Next slide, please. A tort is committed when there is a violation of the law or when the author of the damage fails to act like the model of the average reasonable person. Again, the theory of the structural injustice developed by Young shows that precisely the average behavior inducts the injustice. Therefore, if we make a literal interpretation of what is acting responsibly, it is acting conforming to the law and the average behavior, which leads to humanitarian disasters. But is this a fatality? Next slide, please. The generation of people who were raised with terrorism and the consequences of the global warming is more aware and is morally condemning those actions. Again, the law evolves with morality and is adapting to prevent new events like the one I mentioned. For instance, the French Supreme Court found Total liable for the environmental damage caused. Then it led to the promulgation of several laws which are making easier to prove the tort. The external rules of company are leading it in a more environment responsible way. But the most significant change comes from the multinational themselves. McKeown raises that structural injustice principally comes from powerful agents. The will of the company to change the system and to make the world better could have the biggest impact on the definition of what is acting responsibly. At first, corporate social responsibility was not received by the law and its violation stayed unpunished. But the condemnation from citizens made it hard for the law to ignore the internal rules of the companies, and their efficiency is more and more enshrined. Therefore, corporate social responsibility must be studied as an important tool of the law to avoid humanitarian disaster. The rules external to the company are going to be studied before the rules internal to the company. For the purpose of this symposium's theme, I will only focus on the environmental liability, but the arguments are transposable to human rights in general. Next slide, please. So first, the rules external to the company. The first institution to establish accurate rules against the company about the environment were internationals. The United Nations elaborated in the year 2000 the Global Compact, or World Pact, which is a wheeling-based agreement in which companies are invited to follow 10 principles universally recognized. Those principles are directly inspired by the Rio Summit of 1992, such as adopting a precautionary approach to environmental challenges, encouraging the development and the diffusion of technologies respectful of the environment. The company which subscribes to the principles have to describe in an annual report the way it respects its principle. In 2023, the World Pact established a new version of communication, and its subscribers now have to answer a questionnaire available on the platform. Companies which are communicating in a certain delay are considered as not communicating at all and are excluded from the Global Compact after 1 year if they do not communicate. Another organization involved in the protection of the environment by the companies is the OECD. In 1976, it created principles towards multinational companies which invites to a responsible and ethical behavior in the field of human rights and environment. The states that commit to the OECD have to create control points on their territories that ensure the respect of the principles, the National Contact Points, NCP. After the Rana Plaza scandal, the French NCP was seized by a French minister. The NCP, in its report given in 2013, estimated that the French companies did not embrace a responsible behavior. Though those principles are not enforceable in French jurisdictions, they are not inefficient. Next slide, please. Thank you. They are not inefficient. At first, they kept a statute of declaration of will from the state and the companies and did not really permit the framing of the liability of the companies. But considering the increase of humanitarian catastrophe, the French government decided to act on those principles and gave them a role in French law. Therefore, the 2013 NCP report mentioned before directly inspired the 2017 law about the duty of care. Indeed, since 2016, French laws that bind companies to respect the environment are rising. The Civil Code was modified by the law of the 8th of August of 2016 in order to add the notion of ecological damage. This allows the Environment Protection Association to frame the company liability in case they caused an ecological damage. A law of March 27th of 2017 created the duty of care, which establishes a legal duty to prudent behavior, particularly with regard to the environment. Under this law, huge companies have to elaborate a vigilance plan, which states how the companies are complying with the duty of care and how they make sure that all the companies they are working with also do so. A law of May 22nd of 2019 added to Article 1833 of the Civil Code the mention that companies are managed according to its best interest, which takes into account the social and environmental challenges of its activity. Finally, and more recently, the 13th June of 2024, the European Union proclaimed a directive about duty of care, which has to be translated in French law. So, it has been made undeniable that the French legislator is willing to frame the responsibility of those who do not respect the environment. Next slide, please. Of course, those laws have flaws. the notion used are vague, which make it hard for the judges to give them a practical application. The causality remains hard to prove, especially in cases where there are several agents in the production chain. And the damage does not always occur in France, which makes the law inapplicable. For those reasons, it was thought for a long time that those laws were just translation of a public policy, but were not intended to be applied. However, the French judges have many resources. The vagueness of the wording of the laws has allowed the judges to interpret them, and they are making the first application of the duty of care. The company La Poste has been found liable by the Judicial Tribunal of Paris, December the 3rd of 2023, regarding to the liking of its vigilance plant. The Paris Court of Appeal, in its decision of June 18th of 2024, allowed that the action brought by the Environmental Protection Association against Total under the law of duty of care were admissible. Therefore, it is becoming clear that thanks to the interpretation of the judges, this law can have a huge impact on the framing of the liability of the companies. However, remains one problem. The rule of the liability is to repair after the damage has been caused. Acting responsibility demands to anticipate and prevent the causing of the damage. Next slide, please. So, the rules internal to the companies. The corporate social responsibility of the company started with ethics charts and commitment of will. Those charts were not enforceable and they were just part of the policy and marketing of the companies. However, two tools drastically changed the importance of corporate social responsibility. The first tool is the contract. Two types of contracts are concluded by companies in order to ensure the application of their values. The collective agreement is concluded at the level of the parent company with the trade unions. Though it is not applicable to the subsidiaries companies unless it is replicated, it is applicable to the parent company, which can be bound by the unions. Then, the parent company can put pressure on their subsidiaries companies to make them apply its principle. The second and more efficient kind of contract used by companies relies on the contract with their suppliers. More and more companies add clauses to their contract with their suppliers to precise that their agreement remains only if the supplying company is respecting human rights or environment principle. The second tool, which is used by companies to ensure their corporate social responsibility, is their articles of association. It is said in the civil code that the companies can precise a raison d'être, a purpose according to which they have to allocate resources. It is not an obligation, but it is encouraged. In July 2024, between 107 and 123 French companies have raison d'être. Environmental protection is one of the issues most recognized by these purposes. For instance, Veolia, Engie, and Suez, which are companies that are managing energy resources, include the ecological transition in their raison d'être. The binding effect of those tools can be questioned. First, the question of the... Next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. First, the question of the enforceability is raised. Though the contract and articles of association are supposed to be binding, the fact that they do not directly design the beneficiary raises an issue. Who is entitled to act? Trade unions? For now, the answer remains unclear. But things are changing. The judicialization is happening outside the tribunal. The multiplication of governance systems gives a certain consistency to those principles. The company is supposed to be managed according to this raison d'être. If not, the liability of the organ in charge can be framed in front of the court and furthermore in front of administrative control bodies external to the company, which can impose significant administrative penalties. For instance, the French Prudential Supervision and Resolution Authority controls that the activity of the companies regarding to its risk towards climatic change. However, there is bad news. The French companies which are working with an American government institution have been asked to sign Trump's decree against positive discrimination. This decree is completely against the nowadays policy adopted by many of those French companies. It is not secret what Trump thinks about the environment. What would the companies do in presence of such a decree against policy of ecological transition? They would have a choice between the worldwide sales and the world itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marielle, for your presentation. So I will say that following Kanako Takae's final word that ethics and law together can move toward a framework of relational personhood, you analyze how corporate social responsibility can be translated into law to better prevent environmental and human catastrophe, adding morality to ethics and law to think about environmental responsibility of those in power, especially corporations. So thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have great question to you, to all the panelists of the first panel of these conferences. I would like just to add that following the project we had about responsibility concept in 2023 at the French Research Institute of Japan, I'm very glad how your research advance and progress on this issue, and it really confirmed that judicialization in France in the context of environmental risk, global warming, climate change, but also how it translated to law, it's still a very important subject that we should continue and further develop in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And about this program, we still have some copies of what was being talked, and it's in Japanese for the most part. Marie spoke that day already. She spoke today again. Thank you. The questions can be in Japanese or in English, and the floor is yours for some time. I think a mic will be passing around. And remember that the topic today is not only how to act responsibly, but how to act responsibly today. And the end of the talk by Marie was referring to that situation, to the present. Any question? Welcome. There are questions probably from the panelists themselves, but also we have some journalists in the audience. So if they want to have some more information for their papers, that's the moment for the persons of the first panel. And of course, you may probably have some questions.
Oh, yeah. Is your mic now? Oh, you want to join the Zoom?
No, I thought it would be, it would have been better.
People online also may have questions. So you may write them or send them through the computer system. Otherwise, I would like to stress the importance of corporate social responsibility that you mentioned in the end, because it refers again to the issue that I mentioned of freedom in the introduction. That is it better to leave the initiative to the people in charge, to the traders, to the industrialists, or should there be some governance from above, from the top, to constrain them or to put some restraint on their activities? This is a big issue, which relates to the first question that I was asking to Raphaël: who plans for whom? So maybe you could elaborate, both of you, on this. And for Kanako-san, I had the same kind of question. Who ascribes rights to whom or what? Always thinking that the choices that are made by some body of authority in which there are people. Who is deciding that? Who plans for whom? Who ascribes rights to what and whom? And what about not leaving people free? And I stop, which I like.
Thank you, Gilles, for your question. Actually, the enunciation is very easy. The answer is very difficult. Who plans for who necessitates first to define what is planning, actually. Planning is an intervention on space with an interest, with a goal, and with an intention, right? So it means if you have a goal, if you have an interest, and if you have an intention, you are a planning factor, right? Usually in democracy, planners are public authorities or citizens, and could be private stakeholders. But from a philosophical perspective, we can also add non-citizen individuals, even if it's informal planning, but still planning. It's just not an official one, out of the state of law. And we could add, in the Anthropocene perspective, non-human beings. Planning by non-human beings might be informal planning, and planning for non-human beings is also a rising question. Because now, you know, with AI, we developed a lot of AI urbanism, and space is a scarce resource. Especially urban space is a very scarce resource. Not just in Japan, even if Japanese urban space is a very scarce resource, but all around the world, right? When you add non-human consideration in the planning of urban space, you add even more pressure on a scarce resource. And with AI urbanism, we were talking about autonomous vehicles. They take over a scarce resource because we need to share the urban space and make space for them too, for non-human beings. A lot of AI machines, drones for delivery, sensors, mobile sensors, and so on, are going to be more and more visible in cities, and you have the obligation to make space for them too, but not at the detriment of the previous being you were planning the city for, right? So it tries what Lefebvre calls the right to the city, which is not just the right to be inside of a city physically, whatever you are, a human being or a non-human thing, but also to be part of the decision of how the city and the urban space are planned. And this is related to political regime. In democracy, basically, non-citizen people have no voice in the right to the city. From a neo-Marxist perspective, it's a little bit tricky because they have bodies and they are here, whatever we think about it, right? So it's the answer I can do in a very short time.
Yes, well, it's already a long and detailed answer, which I will say, scarce resources is what economics deals with in the economic theories, etc. And space is political. Basically, that's your message. I understand much better why you are a geographer and not a philosopher, whom you could totally be as well. But space is the reason. Maybe there is an answer or something to say by Marie?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. It's really interesting. Actually, you're basically asking which is the foundation of law. Is it like moral? Does morality becomes law, or does law becomes morality? it's a little bit of both, actually, and it's really interesting to see that in corporate social responsibility. Because, as I said, the liability acts after the damage is caused. So it's to repair the damage. But if we want to prevent the damage, we have to do something like willingly. So we have, it has to come from freedom. And how did we do that? We did that by many laws which encouraged to act freely upon them, which is really interesting. For instance, the framing of the liability of the companies regarding like the security the duty of security has changed, is like now from a prevention perspective. So yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's law is encouraging to act freely, responsibly, and the people also, from their morality, encourage the companies to act freely. So it's in between. Thank you very much. I don't know if I answered very well.
Do we have any question from the audience? It can be in English or in Japanese, both. If there is any question.
Or online?
One question.
Thank you very much. My name is Mukarrab. I'm press consultant, Embassy of Pakistan. My question is that in presence of weak institutions, how the individual will act responsibly? And in the vice versa as well.
In presence of reconstruction?
I mean to say, if there are weak institutions, if they're not able to implement their own decisions, how the individuals can perform their responsibility?
You're asking the question of democracy in representing those interests for those individuals. How can they do if they are not represented as they would or should or prefer to be? The panel 2 by Watanabe Sensei will have a couple of talks dealing with democracies and the limits of democracies. It will be in Japanese, I think, but it will be a kind of answer to your question. Now, maybe some of the panelists want to say something, or Adrienne had a question.
I'm not a specialist of the fields which your question belongs to. But from an urban planner perspective, I can say that planning is not just about physical forms. It's also about social and political regime or assemblage. It means that once you plan in a certain way, you fix directly on space a social and a political regime. So whatever the law is, whatever the political regime is, through planning, you fix a lot of social, political, economical elements on the long run. The question is, when it's fixed, it cannot be overcome easily. So the key point is who are involved in the decision making on the behind the design, because once it's done, actually, the social regime, the social assemblage, which belong to that configuration, that's very concrete and physical assemblage, right, is going to stay on the long run. That's why even if the political regime fails, through planning, a lot of social and political construction will continue to exist.
Any other question?
すいません。日本語で失礼します。はい。先ほど、エリフ先生の最後のところにトランプっていう名前が出てきたんですけれども、トランプ大統領のまた登場によって、保護主義というのが結構また注目っていうかクローズアップされてるんだと思うんですけれども、皆さんご参方の立場から保護主義っていうところに対して、責任ある行動ってどういうふうに考えていらっしゃるかっていうのを教えていただけるとありがたいです。
The answer in English is fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. If I understand correctly, it's how to act responsibly regarding to Trump's policy and protection about the people. And is that the question? Okay, thank you very much for your question. Actually, the companies are in a really tricky situation because the Trump's decree is against positive discrimination, which is basically against French law and against most of the French company policy. So if they were acting responsibly and literally responsibly regarding to the law, they would not sign the decree. But the thing is, they are threatened to lose their most their most economical benefit partnerships. So most of the companies, they are hesitating to sign. So it's really, we are frightened because we are feeling like the basis of the French human rights are threatened by some economical challenges. And this is not supposed to be the way. This is why the European Union was constructed. So now they have a choice, either choose for another partnership in the world, like Canada and everything, and they are doing so. But the American companies remains the best, like economical partner. So they are they want to act not responsibly, and it's really a big issue now in France. And they are like all the big companies. It's a mess. It's actually
Other partners like Japan, for example. 日本もパートナーになれます。Maybe there is a question by Adrienne or Kanako-san.
じゃあ、日本語で質問いただいたので、日本語でお答えしたいと思います。ちょっと私は倫理学が専門ですので、その保護主義の話とかっていうのと直接関わるような答えに、はないんですけれども、おそらく一つ関連して言えるとすれば、倫理学の中で徳倫理学と呼ばれる分野があります。英語で言うとバーチューですね、バーチューエシックス。で、おそらくこういった話にを踏まえると、多分グローバルシティズンシップとかとしての徳概念みたいなもので応答していくことになるのではないかと思います。でこの倫理学の中での徳倫理の位置づけとしてちょっと簡単にご説明しますと、その倫理学っていうのは基本的にある行為に対してこれは正しいのか正しくないのか、良いのか悪いのかっていうことを中心に議論してきているわけですね。なので権利の話とか、あとは自律性の概念、オートノミーみたいな概念っていうのが、中心に据えられて議論されてきたんですけれども、その限界として徳倫理っていうのが出てきた。徳っていうのはだから、皆さんどういうことを連想するかわからないんですけれども、その人の人となりとか、ある物事や状態に対する態度や姿勢っていうところに、焦点が当てられる。行為の正しさとかっていうことではなくて、その姿勢の部分に、紐づくわけですね。でこれはおそらく私がその発表で、主張してきたそのリレーショナル関係的な議論に転換していく必要があるっていうところとも、さらには通じるのかなと思っていまして、その 権利の概念とか、ちょっと先ほどね、インディビジュアリズムで、Why not individualism with relational approach っていう、それは多分かなり valid objection であると思うんですけども、ただ、その権利とか自立性みたいな概念ってやっぱりすごくこう個人に帰属される性質として考えられてきたわけですね。でもやっぱりそのグローバルシティズンシップみたいな話をするときにやっぱりその個人のレベルを超えていくシェアド・レスポンシビリティ共有した責任みたいなものを考えていかなきゃいけないっていうと、その自立や権利みたいな概念をもうちょっとこう個人の枠組みから超えて関係的なものにしていかなければいけない。それはやっぱり共有するという概念とも密接に関わってくると思いますし、でそこで従来の倫理学の行為の正しさっていうものから超えてその姿勢や態度っていうところの徳倫理なんかにつなげて応答していくことができるんではないかというふうに考えています。
Thank you for your question. Because I belong to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I cannot express my personal opinion on that thing. However, three elements of answer I want to emphasize or focus on. First, showing anger, surprise, or negative feeling in such a complex situation is the least responsible attitude we can have. So we must keep serious and open to the dialogue. Second thing is, from an academical perspective, because I am also an academic, right? Being responsible is looking carefully at the situation and trying to analyze it to understand it the best we can. And as long as I have observed the situation, I can say that until now, in the USA, economy was more important than politics. And with Trump, President Trump, we can say that suddenly politics are more important than economy, meaning that whatever the economy is or whatever the economy needs, political perspectives and issues matter more. If you understand that very basic shift, you cannot be surprised at what is going to come next, because it's not a new attitude in the USA, and it's not a new attitude in the world. In China too, nowadays China, politics are more important than economy. And somehow, maybe in the European Union, politics could be, in some cases, more important than economy, right? So we have to act inside of this new context. And the third element of answer I want to bring is that we are not alone, right? This is about international relationship and international trade. So another responsible answer to that question is to straighten relationships between France, European Union, and other countries, especially Japan. Because Japan is a very key country in the globalized economy and in Pacific Asia, as Europe in the Atlantic world and also in the globalized world. So straightening relationship between France, Europe, and Japan is, must be, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, one of the most responsible answer we can bring at the table of the negotiation.
And since I am not reliable to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but only to the Sorbonne University, maybe I can say two things. most trait. One is that we also have historical experience, because economic theory, when it started with Adam Smith, was against two earlier movements of thought, two earlier currents that were mercantilism. For example, in French, that was illustrated by Colbertism. In other European countries, in different ways. In German-speaking countries, that was cameralism, and physiocracy. Those two movements were before liberalism, and liberalism came about because it had good arguments against such policies. In one word, liberalism explains how both sides can be winners in exchanging, and not necessarily one loses what the other wins. Not that. You don't have to be a predator and the other doesn't have to be a prey. Exchange can be proven by economic theories are mutually beneficial. This is one thing. The second thing is that, in one word, when there is an economic policy that works, maybe not for everyone, but for enough people, and that even those who may individually lose at that moment get a chance to another situation. When an economic policy overall works, sacrificing it for political reasons, I say it's correct, in the end never works. And the one who sacrificed economic freedom and economic interest loses in the end, just doesn't see it in time. And we should probably avoid that through partnership, as Raphaël brilliantly said. Now, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I feel bad for Adrienne, who has been with me there and asking, really wanted to ask something. Adrienne. Yes, there is 1 minute for you. For you, there is always time. You take so much of my time that actually there is always time for you.
No, yeah, okay. So if I have the time for one last question, it might be a little bit long question, but you can make it shorter. It's for Kanako. So my question is, if you can come back to the successful and unsuccessful cases and to explain a little bit more the differences. So I would like to know a little bit more about the process behind which bring to a successful cases, and why the second cases you address was unsuccessful from the point of view of ethics, or what are the main factors behind both? More, I would say, in a very short time period, if you can address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. So this legal personhood itself is a very new theme for me. So I haven't really dig down into these cases. So I'm sure there are multiple factors involved in deciding why certain cases are successful and why certain are not. But since this presentation, I want to specifically focus on ethical side, and especially the implication of the traditional ethical arguments. Why ethical arguments are not so influential? Why people, I don't know, it's just as an ethicist, I often been frustrated why ethical arguments are not really well connected with other area of fields like law and economics. And so that was my initial, I guess, problem or question that I had in my presentation. So yeah, so all I can say, I'm sorry. So to answer your question, I just thought I'm sorry, maybe because I'm very foreign to legal personhood issue, but I thought it was quite surprising why, intuitively, like I said in the presentation, animals seem to be more equipped with personhood. I mean, Peter Singer and other animal ethicists do really talk about how we could extend personhood to certain kinds of animals like chimpanzees and other human close mammals. So this case surprised me. Like why rivers and landscapes are accepted as a personhood, and of course there are certain legal issues, enforcement, a level of enforcement and jurisdiction differences, but I wanted to focus more from ethical aspects, and I think that's the discrepancy between ethics and law. Yeah, I'm sorry if I answer you well, but yeah, that's.
No, it's a good answer. Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, that surprisingly, it's more difficult to get the personhood for animals than for river, despite the fact that animals are closer than us than the river. So I really find this point very interesting.
So yeah, one more thing. So anthropocentrism presupposes that we have bias towards humans. So based on this bias, we naturally think those non-human entities that are closer to humans are more valuable than those that are not. And that has been the assumption that in ethical arguments, but that's not the case in legal context. And I thought, I wanted to bring it out in the presentation and try to see how it can be bridged with ethical arguments.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists, to Adrienne by my side always, and to the audience for the questions. The question asked by the honorable member of the Pakistan embassy was a transition that he offered to the second panel. So we'll have a little break, I think, if that's according to the organization, and then we'll have a second panel with three members that will be speaking more in Japanese, but we'll all have this opportunity to listen, and probably you'll get some answers to the question on democracy and how responsibly representation and the reconstitution may happen. Thank you very much again for your attention. I want to thank the people that are online, wherever in the world they are. Not only Japan, not only France, where most of us come from, and Europe, but wherever. And the recording will also make these presentations available again, so you can listen to it again. You can also reach us anytime for questions that you may have later on. And I want to thank again Nira for making the event possible. I want to thank all the panelists for the second panel as well. I will say a few words at the end, and I'm very glad that this is all possible. If journalists or people from the media are interested in asking questions to the people, we all stay here for the time we are available. Thank you very much again. はい、感謝しています。本当にありがとうございました。
はい、ご紹介いただきました慶応大学の渡辺です。このシンポジウム全体で、今、責任ある行動とは何かを考えるということで、パネル1の方では、環境という視点からいろいろ考えてみましたが、パネル2の方では、民主主義という、キーワードを軸に考えていきたいというふうに思います。パネル1の方でもプレゼンないし質疑応答の中で民主主義という言葉が何回か出てきたかと思います。で、なかなか民主主義という、今難しい課題に直面しているというのは皆さんご案内の通りでありまして、民主主義国においてはミドルクラスの没落であるとか格差の拡大、あるいは排外主義の伸長というようなことがあって、いわゆる分断というのが多くの国で指摘されるようになっております。で、単に政治対立が激しくなっているというだけではなくて、その現実に対するその認識の仕方そのものが全く噛み合わないような状況、あるいはその感情的に、ほとんど生理的に自分と意見が合わない人を嫌うっていうか、そういう感情的な分極化というようなこともよく指摘されています。我々対奴らという構図が国内においてもですね、進んでいると。そしてあいつらといいますか、奴らが民主主義を破壊して、自分たちこそ民主主義を守ってるんだと。で、時にその民主主義を守るという名目のもとに極めて権威主義的な行動が取られる場合もあるということですね。そして選挙を通して そうした権威主義というのがますます助長されていく恐れというのも指摘されておりますし、まさに民主的に独裁化していくというかつてのワイマル教区がたどった1930年代の状況にまた戻るんではないかという危惧もよく指摘されているところであります。また国際社会に目を向けてみますと権威主義国の台頭ということもありますし、それからより深刻な問題としてはそれに抗う民主主義国のナラティブというのがさまざまな理由で求心力を失っていると。例えばですけどもフランスも日本もかつて植民地を抱えていたのではないかと、その国が何を偉そうに言ってるんだというふうに言われてしまうとなかなか言い返すのが厳しい面があると。それからそれぞれの民主主義国においてもいろんな矛盾がある。必ずしもその民主的な価値を体現しているわけではないと。そうすると自分のことを差し置いて何か上から目線で語るというその眼差し自体が不快だというふうな反発というのもありますし、言ってることとやってることが違うじゃないかというそのダブルスタンダードだとかその偽善に対する指摘というのも各方面から聞かれるようになりました。で、特に国際社会で注目を集めているグローバルサウスという国々にとってはなかなかこの価値の重要性っていうのは分かるんだけども、しかしその欧米的な、価値というのに今一つ共感できない部分っていうのもたくさんあるという中で、その民主主義あるいは自由で開かれた世界あるいは法の支配といった、そういう、あえて民主主義というふうに分かりやすく言いますけどもいうのが今大きな岐路に立っているということで、そこがこのパネル2の基本的な問題意識でもあります。でこの問題意識を皆さんにパネリストの3人にお話しして、こういったことから何か各それぞれの方々のご専門から何かピンとくるというか、これはお話ししておきたいとか、あるいはこういうことを問題提起したいということを自由に述べてくださいということで、これから早速お三方のプレゼンに移らせていただきたいと思います。発表の順番は少し変えてですね、まず最初は、市原さんで一橋大学大学院法学研究科および、国際公共政策大学院教授でイーストエイジアデモクラシーフォーラムの運営委員会委員長を務められております。また外交、援助や法整備支援などの民主化支援や一部の権威主義国が民主主義社会に対して行う影響力工作に対しても研究をされております。で、2番目のスピーカーは瀬川先生で東京大学大学院法学政治学研究科教授で法哲学を専門に研究されています。現代社会における法の公共性、国家や個人の責任論などについて理論的研究を行っております。そして3番目になりますけども、イザベル・ジロドさんは東京大学大学院総合文化研究科教授で環境科学プログラム機構に所属しておられます。環境問題に関する法的な規範や制度の変化について比較法学のアプローチから研究しておられます。でパネル1と同じようにですね、これからそれぞれ10分から15分ぐらいで発表いただいて、その後私の方からそしてパネルリスト同士で質問をして、その後会場の皆さんあるいはオンラインで質問を受けさせていただきたいと思います。それでは市原先生どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
渡辺先生ありがとうございます。現在今ご紹介に預かりました一橋大学の市原麻衣子と申します。私は国際政治学と比較政治学を掛け合わせる領域で研究をしておりまして、その観点から民主主義というものを見ています。で、このパネルのサブタイトルがグローバル正義と民主主義の課題ということですので、私の方では民主主義が現在受けている挑戦を、国内国際政治の観点から少しお話しさせていただきたいと思います。すいませんが次のスライドをお願いします。民主主義の話をするとき、実は民主主義には複数の側面があるということを認識しておく必要があるのではないかと思っています。一つは制度、そして価値、それからイデオロギーです。で、2つクリックしていただきたいんですが、はい。 制度と価値というのは、国内における、民主主義制度、それから民主主義の制度を守るためのコミットメントとしての、価値へのコミットメントの観点です。そしてもう2つクリックしていただきたいんですけども、このイデオロギーですね、国際政治の領域において民主主義の議論が現れるとき、これはしばしば民主主義をイデオロギーとして捉えているということを認識しておく必要があるかと思います。次のスライドお願いします。民主主義の制度と価値というものを考えるとき、まず民主主義とは何なのかということを簡単におさらいしておく必要があるかと思います。実は民主主義に関しては、共通の定義というのは、存在しないというか、定義をめぐってかなり議論があるところなんですが、ここでは、自由、平等、定期的な選挙と、それから、非選挙権が与えられているということに加えて、この自由で平等な選挙を可能にするために必要なものとしての市民的自由というものも確保されている、こういった制度を民主主義制度と定義したいと思います。これは実質的定義と呼ばれる定義に従っています。市民的自由というのはつまりさまざまな自由権ですね、その言論の自由であったり集会結社の自由であったり、市民が自由に行動を取ることができるというものです。報道の自由なども含まれます。そしてこの市民的自由を確保するためにはさまざまな国内の制度が形成されているわけですが、例えば三権分立ですとか、あるいは法の支配、そして自由権をその整備するための法的なさまざまな制度というものがあります。で実はこうした制度というのは何というか薄い氷のようなもので、この制度を守ろうとこうした民主的な価値に対するコミットメントを知っている行動というものがこの制度を守っているというのが現実です。それなのでこれらの制度が法的に改変されなかったとしても、これらの制度に対する価値の面での攻撃というものが続けば制度自体が弱体化してしまうということが現状です。例えば現在のアメリカの動きを見ますと、予算権限を議会が持っているにもかかわらず、予算に対するアクセスを各省庁に与えなかったりとか、あるいは最高裁判所の判決を大統領府が無視したりとか、特定のメディアのホワイトハウスへの立ち入りを禁止する、あるいはトランスジェンダーへの言論上での攻撃をするなど、こうしたことは制度自体を改変しているわけではないものの、制度を守ろうとする価値へのコミットメントを弱めている、そういった行動になります。でこうしたその価値の部分、価値とか規範を守ろうとして動くという慣習と言ってもいいかもしれませんが、こうしたものが実は民主主義の制度を守るソフトガードレールとして機能しているというふうに、例えばスティーブン・レビツキーとダニエル・ジブラットという2人の研究者が民主主義の死に方という本で書いています。つまり民主主義が機能するためには民主的な制度だけではなくて価値へのコミットメントが非常に重要だというところです。すいません、次のスライドお願いします。そして国際政治の場面で使われる民主主義という言葉に関してもちょっと考えたいと思います。実は民主主義に関してその国際政治の中で語られるとき、主権国家という概念とそれから戦争という概念、この2つと非常に連動して使われる傾向が今まで見られてきたということをご指摘したいと思います。そもそも国家というものは戦争を通じて生まれてきたものであるというような議論が論争はあるんですけれども、あります。例えばここに示しましたがチャールズ・ティリーですね、この、学者なんかは、国家が戦争を起こして戦争が国家を形成してきたというような議論をしています。つまり中世の、時代に例えば都市同盟とか領域国家とか、あるいは教皇を要するキリスト教世界といったさまざまな領域、空間的な広さを持つ主体というものが並列に存在していて、 それぞれがメインのアクターであると考えて世界の中で動いていたわけですが、その中で戦争が行われていくと、戦争の動員に適した領域的な広さの主体が生き残っていくわけですね。でそれでその徴税がギリギリできる程度の広さ、そして徴兵がギリギリできる程度の広さの領域国家がメインのアクターとして残っていきました。このようにしてその領域国家が国際政治を形成する、世界を形成する主権国家体制というものが少しずつ出てきたわけです。でこの主権国家体制の中で民主主義というものは契約としてその国家と国民の間に関係ができていくわけですが、国民の間でその国の自分たちはメンバーであるという意識がなければいけません。でこのメンバーシップに関する意識というものがかなり政治参加をすることによって育まれていく、それによって主権概念がさらに強化されていくというところがあります。そして、政府の側もその、自分たちのその領域国家の中で、我こそが正当な、その統治主体であるということを示さなければいけないわけですので、そうすると、どうしてもその、国内の社会を安定化させるためのガバナンスというものをしっかり行っていかなければなりません。これはロバート・ジャクソンという政治学者が積極的主権という言葉で示したものなんですけれども、主権国家だと認められるためには国内をガバナンスする能力がなければいけない。そしてそのガバナンスというものには例えば人権を守るとか、そういった自由主義的な動きの部分も含まれるというふうに考えられていました。それですので、民主的な社会、自由主義的な行動、価値というものを守るという動きが主権国家内の政府の側からも取られていくということになります。さらに、そこにちょっとフランシス・福山の名前も入れましたが、ロシアのウクライナ侵攻があってからですね、改めてリベラリズムの研究者の中で国家の役割を見直すという動きがありました。どうしてもその民主主義とかリベラリズムっていう議論は国境を容易に超えて議論をするようになるわけですけれども、しかしその積極的主権というものが重要性を持っていて、主権国家体制の中でその各国が動いている、政治が動いているということを考えると、やはり人権とか民主主義というものは第一義的には国の政府によって提供されなければいけない。それなしにはやはり無秩序な世界になってしまいますので、それなので、民主主義とか人権をその主張するにしても結局国家というものが重要なんだということを再認識するきっかけになったわけです。そして戦争と民主主義のところの関係性ですけれども、戦争が行われるとき、人々の動員をかけて、敵対する国家と戦わなければいけないわけですが、この時にその旗の下の結集効果、みんながこうアイデンティティをこう持って、我々は一つのグループであるという、そういう意識を強める、そういった言動が多々使われます。でその時にアイデンティティ、例えば、ナショナリズムのようなアイデンティティというものも利用されるんですが、民主主義というものも一つ利用されるアイデンティティの、中に入ってきます。これはその我々民主主義国同士は、共に結集して戦いましょうとか、民主主義国家が、今まさに攻撃を受けているということを受けて、我々は彼らを同じ民主主義国として救わなければいけないと、そういった形で言説化されていくわけです。すいません、次のスライドお願いします。でこのようにしてその、民主主義の言説というものが戦争の中でも用いられていくわけですが、この民主主義の言説は、国際レベルで用いられているとき、民主主義の制度と価値の話はしていません。そのことが、実はその第一章言のところに書いてあるんですけども、民主主義国が国際政治の中で民主主義を語るとき、これは同意のための言説として彼らと我らというふうに差別化を図るための、言葉として使われてきました。例えば第二次大戦期にはファシズムと対抗する我らとしての民主主義、 冷戦期には共産主義と対抗する我らとしての民主主義、そして21世紀には権威主義あるいは専制主義と対抗するものとしての民主主義というような言説が国際政治の中で広く使われてきたわけです。しかしここで気をつけなければいけないのは、このようにその民主主義を守るための戦いとされているものは、実は民主主義制度を守るための戦いではなくて、民主主義制度を持つ国を守るための戦いです。それなので、民主主義の制度と価値というものとは、かなり離れたディスコースで民主主義の概念が利用されているということに注意を、する必要があります。でそうした時に、民主主義国の国内においては、主に慣習や価値規範といったものへの、民主主義的な慣習価値規範といったものへの攻撃が続いていて、それによって制度が弱体化しているという、現状があるわけなので、民主主義国に関しては、国内においても国際社会の中でも、民主主義の、概念というものが偽善性を持つものとして、理解され、がちになっているということです。でそれでは権威主義国の側は何もしていないかといいますと、権威主義国の側からも、民主主義の、価値に対するコミットメント信念を、弱めるような動きが見られます。国際的には影響工作と言われるものが行われています。権威主義国が、民主主義社会を狙って、その社会の中の分断を加速させて社会の不安定化を図ろうと、偽情報を流したり、あるいはマルインフォメーションという言い方をしますけれども、悪意ある情報ですね、情報を恣意的な形で見せることによって人々の印象を操作するというようなことを行っています。で同じことは、民主主義国同士の関係を、悪化させようという、意図でも行われていて、例えば日本の場合には日本とアメリカの関係とか日本と韓国の関係とか、日本と台湾の関係などを狙った、こうした影響工作が行われています。そして、権威主義国の国内においても、こうした動きはありまして、特に、民主主義に関わるところの、概念、特に、選挙、人権、法の支配、民主主義、こういった概念が利用されて、これらの政府の中での政府の、統治の正当化に、使われているという傾向があります。例えば、この4つの概念っていうのは国際的な正当性がある概念で、それなので自分たちの正当化をするために利用するわけですが、選挙というのは先ほど申し上げたようにその自由で公平に行われなければいけないわけですけれども、例えば不正選挙を行っていても、野党を解党した状態で選挙を行っていても、これは選挙であるというふうに主張して、我々は選挙で選ばれた正当な政府なんだという言い方をします。そしてまた権威主義国の一部は人権という概念についても、人権という概念はさまざまな要素を包含している概念ですが、その中でもその自由権に関しての議論を完全に切り離した状態で、我々は社会権を提供していますと、開発する権利というものを発展する権利というものを人々に認めている政治国家ですというふうに主張することで、我こそが民主主義国であるという主張をします。このようにして選挙、人権、法の支配、民主主義など、これらすべてが自由権を内包する概念であるにもかかわらず、これらの概念の中から自由権の部分を切り離した形でこれらの概念を守っている、これらの概念に基づいて政治を行っているのが我々であるというふうに主張しているわけです。このようにして民主主義国、権威主義国ともに国内の両方のレベルで民主主義というものに対する攻撃を熾烈化しているというものが現在の状況であると捉えられると思います。すみません、以上です。どうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。戦争と民主主義の関係、それから、民主主義を偽装する、権威主義国、そして実態として、その民主的な価値を、放棄しかねないその民主主義国の実情について非常に面白い視点から、お話しいただいたと思います。そうしましたら次、滝川先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
滝川と申します。東京大学で法哲学という科目を教えております。本日は責任についての、リスポンシビリティについての国際ワークショップということで、特にそのパネル2はデモクラシーの観点から議論することになっているかと思います。そこでタイトルとしては、その誰に対する責任なのかで、こういう問題を立ててみました。一体誰に対する責任なのか。で、こういう問題を導きの意図としながら、そのデモクラシーの限界と希望について、それがあれば論じるということをしてみたいというふうに思います。じゃあ次のスライドをお願いいたします。はい。で、まずその出発点としてですね、そのデモクラシーの境界問題っていうふうに言われる問題から話をしたいというふうに思います。このデモクラシーの境界問題っていうのは一体どういう問題かというとですね、ここに書いてあるように、そのデモクラシーで一体誰がデモスなのかって、こういう問題です。そのデモスっていうのは日本語で言うと有権者ってことですね。そのデモクラシーにおいて一体誰が決定権限を持つんだろうかと。そのデモクラシーって、一定の領域を持った存在なわけですね。例えば日本でもアメリカでもいろんなその民主主義国家っていうのは境界を持っているわけですが、じゃあ一体その境界線を一体どこで引くのかっていうのが、ここでいうそのデモクラシーの境界問題です。で、このデモクラシーの境界問題はですね、しかしデモクラシーにとって極めて難しい問題だというふうに考えられているわけです。なんでじゃあデモクラシーの境界問題がデモクラシーにとって難問なのかというと、それはこの境界問題をデモクラシーはそれ自体では解決できないからです。これ考えてみるとすぐ分かると思うんですが、例えばある人たちが集まってきていて、これから誰がこのデモクラシーに参加するかっていうのを決めようとするとします。じゃあその誰がデモクラシーに参加するかを決めよう、誰が参加できて、誰が参加できないかを決めようとするときに、じゃあその決定を民主的に、デモクラシーで行おうとするとですね、じゃあその決定自体に誰が参加すればいいのかって問題が出てくるわけですね。で、そうすると、じゃあその決定自体に誰が参加すればいいのかっていう問題自体を、じゃあまたデモクラシーで決めようとすると、どんどん遡っていってしまうと。結局決められない。なので、このデモクラシーの境界問題っていうのは、このデモクラシーにとって極めて重要な、そのデモクラシーにおいてデモスの範囲って極めて重要な問題であるにもかかわらず、それ自体をデモクラシーは解決できないんじゃないだろうか。これがデモクラシーの境界問題というふうに言われる問題なわけです。次のスライドをお願いいたします。はい。じゃあ、この問題に対して、現在、実際にはどういう回答が与えられているのか。これについては、次のように言うことができるでしょう。その現状としてはですね、その成人の国民のみが有権者となっている。これが現在の各デモクラシーの制度になっているわけです。その成人のみが、しかもその成人の中でも一定のその国籍を持っている、その国民だけがそのデモスであると。で、その他の人たちは排除するような形で、デモクラシーのデモスの境界っていうものを形成した上で、その中でその人たちが決定権限を持って決定をする。これが現在のデモクラシーの体制だということになるわけです。で、これが現在の、実際に行っているその境界問題の回答だってことになるわけですが、そうするとですね、問題が生じてきます。このどういう問題が生じるかっていうと、これが仮に現在の境界問題に対する回答だとするとですね、このデモクラシーには2つの限界があるんじゃないかということになるわけです。次のスライドを、ありがとうございます。で、2つの限界というのは一体どういう限界があるか、ここで2つ空間の問題とですね、時間の問題、この2つに分けて少し確認しておきたいと思います。1つは空間的な限界です。今申し上げたように、そのデモ数の範囲っていうのは国民に限定されているわけですね。とすると、国民でない人たち、つまりそのある国家の外部、国境の外部にいる人たちに対して、デモクラシーっていうのは参加権を与えていないわけです。でしかし、現在の世界の政治を見てみるとですね、ある国の決定というのは他国に対しても影響をもちろん与えるわけですね。例えばその一定の国が関税を課すとですね、その他の国に対して大きな影響を与えるわけです。しかし、その空間を超えた外側の人たちに対しては、その民主的な決定権が与えられていないと。で、ここから生じてくるのが、いわゆるそのグローバルな不正義っていうふうに言われるものです。 その現在、そのグローバルな問題っていうのはいろいろあるわけですが、その典型例として、グローバルな貧困と格差、このグローバルな貧困と格差っていうのは、以前に比べると相当改善されてはいるものの、現在もあるわけですね。で、この問題に対して、そのデモクラシー、そのデモスっていうものを政治の国民に限定するようなデモクラシーっていうのは、十分対処できないということになるわけです。これが、デモクラシーの一つ目の限界である空間的な限界です。で、デモクラシーにはもう一つ限界があります。それが、時間の面での限界です。これは何かというと、そのデモクラシーっていうのは、現在の政人に、国民に対してだけ決定権限を与えるわけですね。で、しかし、現在のそのデモクラシーが行った決定っていうのは、将来に対して、直近では子どもたちに対してもそうですし、将来世代に対しても大きな影響を与えるわけです。具体的に言うと、例えば年金問題などについて、その現在の子どもたちに対して、例えば日本のように少子高齢化が進んでいくとですね、将来年金その制度っていうのは持たないかもしれない。けれども、そういうその年金制度っていうのを変えていくようなその決定権限は子どもたちに与えられてないわけですね。あるいはその環境問題とか資源の問題、パート1のところでも議論されていたと思いますが、こうした問題は現在世代に対してだけ影響を与えるわけではなくて、将来世代に対しても影響を与えるわけです。でしかし、この問題に対してデモクラシーっていうのは対処できない。なぜなら、そのデモスの範囲っていうのが限界があって、それは現在の成人の国民に限定されているからです。次のスライドをお願いいたします。でとするとですね、結局デモクラシーについては、この責任の赤字っていうものがあるんじゃないかっていうふうに言うことができるわけです。つまり、デモクラシーは、その構造上ですね、その外部に対する責任っていうのを変えてしまうんじゃないだろうか。そのデモクラシーには、そのデモスの外部がいるわけですね。境界を引いていて、内部と外部に分けて、内部の人に決定権限を与えるわけなので、その外部の人たちは決定に参加できないわけです。とすると、しかしその人たちの利害っていうものが、そのデモクラシーにおいては無視されてしまうんじゃないだろうかと。で、それは具体的に言うと、どういう人たちが実際に排除されてしまうのか、あるいはどういう人たちに対する責任がかけてしまうのかというと、一つは先ほどの空間的な制限に対処するような形で、その他国の人々ですね。他国の人々も実際にはある政治体制、デモクラシーである、他の国でもそうなんですが、民主主義の国によって影響を受けるわけですが、その人たちに対しては、十分な責任を持った決定がなされないっていうのが一つ目です。で、もう一つは将来世代ですね。将来世代に対して、そのデモクラシーっていうのはその決定によって影響を与えるんだけれども、しかしその人たちは決定に参加できないので、その人たちに対する責任が不足してしまう。この2つの問題が生じてくるわけです。次のスライドをお願いいたします。で、これが、仮に現状の問題だとすると、一体どういう方策があり得るのかと。これは3つ確認してみたいというふうに思います。一つが、現状維持ですね。で、これなんで現状維持の一応入れたかっていうとですね、これ変えていくっていうのは結構難しい。今から少しずつ変え方についてもお話ししていくんですが、変えるのは難しいので、現状維持っていうのは一つのオプションであることは間違いありません。もしかしたら現実にフィージブルな、政治的に言って、実行可能な選択肢っていうのはこの現状維持しかないかもしれません。これが一つです。で、二つ目の選択肢が、デモスを拡張していくっていうやり方です。今申し上げたように、デモクラシーっていうのは外部に対する責任を欠いてしまうっていうのが問題ですので、それを変えるための一つのやり方は、そのデモスの範囲っていうのを、境界線をですね、拡張してみると。それが一つのやり方です。これはいわばそのデモクラシーを徹底することによって、より多くの人たちに対して責任を負うような、こういう制度構想だというふうに言うことができます。で、3つ目はですね、そのデモクラシーってちょっともう諦めると。そのデモクラシーっていうのは内在的に欠陥が抱えているので、デモクラシー以外の制度配備を考えるのはどうだろうかって、これが3つ目のオプションになります。次のスライドをお願いいたします。で、まず1つ目のオプションだった、なんていうんですかね、現状維持以外の2つ目のオプションであった、有権者の拡張から確認しておきます。 で、この問題を考えるとき、先ほどの境界問題を考えるときに、現在の解決方法は、現実、成人の国民に対してだけ、その決定権を与える、それだけがデモスだって、こういう考え方だって話を申し上げました。で、しかしですね、私がやっているような法哲学とか政治哲学の領域で、有力だっていうふうに考えられている考え方が、ここでご紹介したい、その影響原理っていう考え方です。これどういう考え方かというと、これは簡単な考え方です。で、その誰がデモスなのか、そのデモスの範囲っていうのは、その決定から影響を受けるすべての人だというふうに言うべきなんだっていうのは、これが影響原理、All Affected Principle という考え方です。つまり、ある決定を行うと、いろんな人に影響が及ぶわけですね。とすると、その決定から影響を与えるすべての人に対して、例えば具体的に言うと投票権を与える。こういう制度こそが、望ましい、正しい制度なんだ。こういうふうに考えるのが影響原理です。で、多分この考え方は、例えばアメリカの独立戦争なんかの時の、代表なければ課税なしっていうような考え方って、この考え方に非常に近いわけですね。で、こういう影響原理を徹底することによって、そのデモスの範囲を拡張するっていうのが一つのやり方です。で、この考え方を徹底するとどういうことになるかっていうと、例えばその外国人の参政権、選挙権っていうものを認めると。で、ここで重要なのはどの範囲の外国人に対して認めるかというと、この影響原理からするとですね、単にある国内に住んでいる外国人に対して決定権を与えればいいって話になるだけではなくて、そのデモクラシーの決定によって影響を受けるその国の外部に住んでいる外国人にもある決定に対してその投票権を持つべきだって、こういう考え方になるわけですね。例えばアメリカの大統領というのはその世界中の人々に対して大きな影響を与えるわけですね。とするとアメリカの大統領選については別にアメリカ国民だけではなくて、その他の国に住んでいる他の国の国民も投票権を持つべきだ。こういうインプリケーションが影響原理から出てくるということになります。で、他にその影響原理から出てくるインプリケーションとしては、例えば子ども選挙権ですね。現状では現在に行われているそのデモクラシーにおいては、どこの国でもその子どもに対して選挙権を与えてません。子どもっていうのは、その成人年齢より下の例えば18歳とか16歳以下の子どもに対しては選挙権を与えていないわけです。しかし、この子どもたちもその民主的な決定によって大きな影響を受けるわけですから、この子どもたちに対しても選挙権を与えるべきだって考え方は当然この影響原理から出てくるわけです。しかもそれだけではなくて、その将来世代も仮に現在まで生まれてない世代もこの現在の世代によって影響を受けるのであれば、その人たちに対しても投票権を与えるべきじゃないかって、こういう話になってくるわけです。で、こういうふうに考えてみるとですね、この影響原理によって有権者の範囲を拡張するというやり方あるわけでありえます。ですが、この将来世代への責任というものを考えるとですね、将来世代もデモスの範囲に含めるっていうのは、実際かなり難しいだろうということになるわけですね。それなんでかっていうと、まだこの世にいない人たちを一体じゃあ誰が代表できるのか。その人たちは本当にその将来世代の人たちの選考を正確に把握できるだろうか。こういう問題が出てくるからです。なので、この影響原理によって、おそらく2つの欠陥のうちですね、デモクラシーの2つの欠陥のうち、その空間的な限界については、この影響原理で答えることはできるかもしれませんが、その時間的な限界について、影響原理で考えることは難しいかもしれません。で、私の報告を少しまとめておくことが、この次の最後のスライドなんですが、これですね。で、今までの話を、簡単に一言でまとめてしまうとどういうことになるかというとですね、そのデモクラシーでは果たしきれない責任があるっていうことは、やっぱり認めざるを得ないってことです。そのデモクラシーっていうのは、そのごく一部のデモスだけに決定権を与えるわけですね。で、そうするとその外部の人たちっていうのを排除してしまうことになると。で、そうするとですね、その外部の人たちに対する責任っていうのが、組み尽くさない責任っていうものが、どうしても残ってしまうんだということは、これは多分認めざるを得ないわけですね。で、この限界を認めた上で、その一つの方向性はデモクラシーを活用することだと。そのより多くの人にその決定権を与えるというやり方もあるかもしれませんし、他方でもう一つのやり方、先ほど少しだけ触れた デモクラシー以外の制度配備っていうのは、例えばどういうものかっていうと、その憲法にですね、その権利条項を書いておくと。例えば子どもの権利とか将来性の権利っていうのを書いておいて、で、それを例えば裁判所が審査すると。こういう裁判所が審査するわけなので、その民主的な決定権限をその将来世代が持つわけではないけれども、それとはそのデモクラシーの制度の外部でですね、その将来世代に対する責任を果たしていく。こういうやり方が、あるかもしれません。しかし考えてみるとどれも結構難しいやり方なんですが、しかし最後に申し上げたいのは、デモクラシーっていうのは私は悪い人ではあるとは全然思いませんが、しかし限界があると。責任を果たすことが我々にとって一番重要なものだとするとですね、その限界があると。じゃあ責任を手放さないように一体どういう制度配備ができるかということを探求することが重要だということになるということになるわけです。はい、ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。
滝川先生、どうもありがとうございました。デモクラシーが抱えるトートロジーといいますか、自己循環論的な視点を、境界問題というふうに位置づけて、いくつか非常に示唆に富むお話をいただいたと思います。そうしましたら、次にジロド先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Very much, and I'm shifting to English. Thank you very much again for your invitation and for allowing me to present in English. And my warmest thanks in advance to the translators. So I will try to situate my presentation in the continuity of the previous presentations, although it might be developed from a slightly different perspective. And in so doing, I will make some connections with panel one. In any case, I will try to make it short. So the question is, again, how to act responsibly today, and to rephrase the question, so how to act responsibly in the Anthropocene. And that's indeed a vast and rather intimidating question. So initially proposed by Earth system scientists, the Anthropocene thesis, as explained in the first panel, contends that particular human activities have become a geophysical force capable of disrupting the relative ecological stability that has sustained life on Earth. In other words, the Anthropocene shifts the narrative of what we traditionally call environmental degradation by marking that human impact has collectively reached a global scale, threatening ecosystems and the viability of human life. But the Anthropocene is a controversial term. Its definition, starting date, and causes remain largely contested. And indeed, as a geological concept, it has faded quite quickly. Last year, it was officially rejected as a new epoch by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And obviously, this decision to reject the Anthropocene epoch came as a major disappointment to Earth system scientists who saw its potential recognition as a moment for underscoring the broad scientific consensus on the structural impacts of human activities on the Earth system. But the Anthropocene has been widely received through environmental sciences, humanities, and social sciences, including law and governance research, as a useful new conceptual framework for understanding human relationships with nature, the Earth system, and so-called more than human worlds. So the underlying hypothesis of the Anthropocene is that any clear-cut divide between ecosystems and social systems, humans and non-human nature, subjects and objects, as neatly bounded categories and distinct realm of reality, such distinctions is no longer viable. And such an understanding, of course, does raise some issues. First, the Anthropocene thesis, by associating all humanity with the environmental crisis, necessarily fails to differentiate between social actors, and it ignores varied responsibilities, liabilities, and impacts of different groups of human beings in time and space. And in addition, it becomes increasingly difficult for individuals and communities to identify themselves as geological agents and thus input to themselves responsibility for the harms resulting from anthropogenic disruptions such as climate change. But despite such drawbacks and shortcomings, the Anthropocene designation remains, again, an important scientific and popular innovation that can prompt a reflection on new models of responsibility for new conditions. Up to a certain extent, lawyers have started to discuss the implications of the concept. And here we would like to focus on the field of environmental law. Where are we now? I guess it's the third or... It's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a slight a gap between my slides and the text, but anyway, you can follow on the screen. So I will definitely focus my attention on environmental law. In fact, a majority of international environmental lawyers tend to focus their attention on regulatory and institutional reforms in an attempt to prevent or to fix the Anthropocene. And in fact, in traditional environmental law, nature has primarily been regulated as a source of wealth regulation, wealth generation as natural resources, while the so-called natural environment has mainly been construed as a passive object of human protection and control. Yet, a minority of legal scholars have started to question current schemes and normative assumptions for regulated exploitation, control, and managed protection for the environment. And reflecting then from a critical perspective on how to act responsibly in the Anthropocene, this question suggests to focus on what it would mean, what it would imply for international environmental law to acknowledge the core notions of entanglement that the Anthropocene foregrounds. What would it be for international environmental law to recognize that the Anthropocene thesis characterizes as entangled human, non-human agency and refers to entangled harms? So we can move on to, next slide, thank you. So from this point of view, the question raised by the organizers of today's conference necessarily invite lawyers to put the concepts of state responsibility and environmental protection currently available to international legal thinking into further critical perspective. And in order to illustrate my point, I will concentrate on the issue of climate change and on one legal mechanism in particular, namely transnational climate litigation, which provides a good basis for discussion. In fact, this form of litigation has become a strategic tool to press state and non-state actors into action. And so precisely, what are the various strategies developed so far in transnational climate litigation? Do these strategies put forward by the claimants, including in Japan, are really helpful in discerning more clearly how to act responsibly in the Anthropocene? To which extent do these strategies developed by claimants in climate change litigation, do they pave the way for greater involvement in responding to the emergence of new vulnerabilities? And if such litigation strategies fall short, which is often the case, then how to reconfigure the scope of attention and accountability for climate harms? So the examination of transnational climate litigation so far reveals important developments. One important development to start with, in fact, litigation serves as a good opportunity for stories to be told, stories about justice, about harm. It also offers an introspective mechanism of law's own inconsistencies. And climate change litigation in particular offer moments of legal reasoning during which internal inconsistencies within law are emerging as disruptive sources of conflict. And so we can observe first a marked move, a significant move from a traditional liberal approach to climate justice towards what can be described as a progressive critical approach to climate justice. So let me explain very briefly. Traditional environmental cases have generally been discussed, following a liberal approach, which conceives climate justice in reference to actual harms of human victims falling within the territorial jurisdiction of states and mostly affecting present generations. So cases involving transboundary environmental harms, however, raise more complex issues. Under international law, a state is responsible for an internationally wrongful act, provided that the action or omission that led to the illegal act can be attributed to the state's conduct or effective control. But these rules of state responsibility are, of course, difficult to apply to transboundary environmental harms. And for this reason, a legal infrastructure has been developed to safeguard environmental protection through forms of preventive, institutional, and managerial collaborations. For example, we have now a network of international cooperation which allows states to share information and best practices, to undertake early consultations on environmental risks and impact assessments, to notify affected states of existing problems, and also to provide technological and financial support and so forth. We can move on the following slide. However, anthropogenic disruptions of ecological processes triggered by the global fossil fuel economy can arguably be viewed as a failure at planetary scale of this no harm rule. And in contrast to traditional cases of cross-border pollution, the causes and effects of climate change fundamentally challenge the attribution of legal liability. Obviously, climate harms are characterized by a permanent flow of entangled actions and reactions vastly spread across matter, across subjects, space, and time. And so in practice, the complex physical reality of climate harm has often been used in court by defendants as a tactic of de-responsabilization. And in fact, in several cases, responsible actors, while acknowledging being geophysically active in the advent of the Anthropocene, still try to evade their obligations by featuring climate change as a global phenomenon arising from myriad acts committed by innumerable private and state entities over decades that are unquestionably beyond the jurisdiction and control of one state. So it's the perfect words to de-responsabilize oneself. And this kind of argument is very often developed in climate litigation case by the defendants. So to handle the complexity of such harms, regimes of international regulation have of course tried to ensure commitments from states and coordinate kind of global response to prevent and mitigate its cause and effects. However, such governance is based on a system of causality and attribution, which requires the establishment of a causal link between a particular harm and a specific human right violation for an applicant, for a claimant, to be admitted before a human right mechanism. And that's precisely such a causal nexus requirement, which is a procedural requirement, which has become an important point of contestation, prompting transnational legal mobilization to loosen the link between individual perpetrators and victims of climate harms. Hence, over the past few years, in both domestic and international settings, climate policies, including in Japan, and litigation have been showing kind of move towards what has been described in the literature as a progressive, critical approach to climate justice. And this development has significantly contributed to expand the scope of attention and accountability from actual to potential harms, from human to non-human subjects, from territorial to extraterritorial obligations, and from present to future generations. And today, this progressive or so-called progressive approach to climate justice is entering mainstream legal discourse and practice already. So this is indeed an important move. But it's not sufficient, and okay, we are just there. It's not sufficient, and this progressive approach
is not without its own limitations. Fundamentally, this move in practice does not go as far as recognizing the entanglement of climate harms across space and time and across human and non-human species. By contrast, if we try, at least now, to take seriously the notion of entanglement that the Anthropocene so powerfully foregrounds, it would be then possible to envision a different approach to rights-based approaches to climate harms. And for this reason, critical legal scholars, have recently advocated for the development of a so-called reparative approach to climate justice. Such an approach consists in reconfiguring the current boundaries of traditional rights-based approaches to climate harms in terms of subjectivity. And the question here is definitely who is affected by climate harms, not necessarily only humans. Spatiality means what is the territorial scope of climate harms, and temporality, how far in the past and future do climate harms stretch. According to a minority of critical legal scholars, and the most interesting one, according to my understanding, is Mary Petersman. She's now based in the UK, and she has been convincingly arguing in strong support of this more radical approach. And she contends that the diffused nature of climate harms, far from serving a justification for deresponsabilization and inaction, indeed injustice, could, on the contrary, serve instead to ground the notion of entangled harms to be translated into specific places and peoples. I'm going to go faster. In that sense, and as she underlines, the dispersed nature of climate harms would not be weaponized against vulnerable victims, but on the contrary, could be used by the claimants in climate change litigation to widen their claims for repair across the multiple spatial temporalities through which they have been harmed. And so here it's necessarily a qualitative shift in sensibility in our understanding, which consists in, rather than privileging a rights-based approach to climate justice, as mentioned in panel 1, it should, on the contrary, imply to start thinking based on the notion of more than human care in terms of obligation. And so it conceives of humans and non-humans not as strictly independent, but recognize humans and non-humans' agency as emerging from and enacted through their encounters and asymmetrical power relations. So just to conclude, the transboundary enduring nature of climate harms obviously poses distinct challenges to international environmental and human rights law. It necessarily questions the plasticity of law and governance, means its ability to transform into new designs that attend to more than human concerns and multi-species justice. Different approaches to climate justice determine and condition how climate harms can be registered and addressed in international law, for example, before courts. And the question again raised by the organizers of how to act responsibly today, how to act responsibly in the Anthropocene, taken seriously, should prompt us to consider what lies outside the lines of sight of the mainstream legal discourse and practice. And from there, we still, of course, need to explore how to set up legal mechanisms that more fully account for the entangled character of climate harms, the need for more than human care, as well as the terrestrial specialities and enduring temporalities of climate change far beyond the next generations. And in that sense, the Anthropocene narratives and corresponding approaches to climate justice not only question the justiciability of climate harms in international law, but they also have implications for strategically imagining or reimagining responses to ambiguous harms and disproportionate vulnerabilities in our contemporary
era. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for this presentation in English, and my thanks to the translators. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。パネル1に出てきました、その人新世という視点から、次世代の責任、特に誰に対して責任を負うのかっていう点に着目しながら、ある意味では滝川先生のプレゼントも重なる部分が多かったと思います。どうもありがとうございました。そうしましたら、最初私の方から各パネリストの方にちょっとお伺いしたいことを、それぞれ一つずつ質問したいと思います。このパネルに期待することというのを事前に皆さんの中からお寄せいただいたので、それを勘案しながら質問させていただきたいと思います。まず市原先生なんですけども、今のアメリカで、その見方によってはまるで自らこの民主主義っていうのを放棄して、権威主義化しているようにも思えると。で一方アメリカの中にはそのリベラル疲れだとか、あるいは国際社会を見るとこのリベラリズム疲れのようなものも起きていると。でアメリカやフランス、それから日本もですね、一時的にこの帝国主義ないし植民地を有していた時代があって、そうした国々が語る正義のダブルスタンダードというものが批判される傾向にもあると。でしかしそれを放っておくと1930年代あるいはその19世紀的なその法の支配ではなくてその力による支配に戻ってしまう危険性もあると。そうした中でその過去に戻ることなく、かといってその欧米中心っていいますか、その西側中心のその協情主義に陥ることなく、その国際秩序っていうのを保っていくないし再生していくには、その次世代への責任として、どういう制度改革というのが望ましいというふうにお考えになられているかということです。で次滝川先生で空間軸と時間軸を広げていくというのは、言ってみれば我々意識をいかに広げていくかという問いにも関わってくるかと思います。しかし現実にはですね格差の拡大ですとか、あるいはその中道派とかエリートに対する求心力というのも低下していますし、それからフィルターバブルという言葉に象徴されるように個人化ないしその分断をですね細分化を助長するような情報技術の環境も出てきていると。でまた反移民の感情というのも高まっていると、そう考えてみると果たしてその民主主義というのがどこまで今後持続可能なのか考えてみれば、その市民が、デモスが、そのある程度、都市国家はともかくとしてある程度大きな国を統治するっていうのはその歴史っていうのはそう長くはなくて、それがゆえにアメリカっていうのは人類史における実験国家というふうに言われたわけですけども、その歴史っていうのはまだ250年ぐらいしかないわけで、たまたまいろんな諸条件が合致して、偶然この250年を何とか言ったかもしれないと、資本主義との民主主義の相性って本当にいいものなのか、あるいは情報技術ってこのまま発展していたけど本当に民主主義と相入れるものなのかとか、人口動態と民主主義っていうのはどの程度まで折り合いがつくものなのかといった、ことを考えると250年が偶然だったんではないかと。でこのまま続いていく保証っていうのはもしかするとどこにもないかもしれないと。しかしそれはあまり良くないわけで、そうならないためにはですね、次世代への責任あるいは他者への責任として、どういった具体的な制度改革っていうのを今のうちから進めていった方がいいのかということについてお伺いしたいと思います。それからジロド先生なんですけども、人申請の問題意識というのは理解はできるわけですけれども、しかし一方で現実世界を見てみますと、多くの先進国で、いわゆる右派が台頭してきておりまして、アメリカもそうですけどもESG ですね、エンバイロメント、ソーシャル、ガバナンスという、そういう考え方そのものからむしろ脱退するような枠組みから脱退するような企業というのも出てきております。人申請という発想の大切さを現代においてどういうふうにそれを示していけばいいのか、その有効な 具体例というか事例がすでに存在するのか、あるいは先生自身が何か想定されていらっしゃるのか、そして法律の改正も含めてですね、どういうような制度改革を今起こしておくことが次世代への責任だというふうにお考えになられているかについて手短にお答えいただければと思います。では石原先生お願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。ものすごく大きな話題だと思います。国際秩序をどう再生することができるかというのは、今現在非常にペシミスティックにならざるを得ないところもあるわけですけれども、2つのことだけ、考えたいと思います。一つは、アメリカ、ポピュリズムの波は、各国で起こっているわけですが、今まで、長きにわたって単極構造のような状態で覇権国家として、国際公共財を提供してきたアメリカというものがその役割から顕著に撤退をしてきているというのがトランプ政権の在り方だと思います。でそうすると、覇権安定論的な国際秩序の捉え方というものをそもそも、他国が全てやめなければいけないというのがベースにあるんじゃないかと思います。多国間主義というものを覇権国とみなされてきたアメリカに頼って、維持形成していこうとするのではなくて、それ以外の国々が、リーダーシップ、主体性を持たなければいけないと思います。で、そう考えると例えば日本とか欧州カナダとか、アジアにおいては例えば韓国台湾インドなど、そういった国々がリードをしていって、既存の国際制度を守るということをしていかなければいけないとは思います。ただ先生がまさにご指摘されたようにそのポピュリズムの波というものがこれらの国々の中で非常に大きくて、で、その意味では日本のように、比較的まだポピュリズムの波が弱い国というものが引っ張っていかないといけないわけですが、しかしそれだけではおそらくフォースとして弱いと。でそうすると、アクターの多様化というものも国際社会の中で考えていかないといけないんだろうと思います。で特にその、ポピュリズムの波が、右派ポピュリズムの形で典型的に、欧米においては特に現れていて、で自由主義の、考え方に対する、不人気がものすごくあるということを考えると、じゃあ誰が自由主義を今でも担っているアクターなのかということを考える必要があるかと思います。でその点では、NGO ですとか、メディアですとか、あるいは研究者、こういった方々が、いかにその政府、一部のそのまだリベラリズムを信じている政府と共同関係を築いて、1.5 トラックのアプローチで国際秩序を守っていくことができるのかということが必要になるかと思います。
そうしましたら瀧川先生お願いします。
貴重な質問どうもありがとうございます。デモクラシーの未来ということでなかなか難しい問題なんですけれども、この問題考えるときにはなんていうの比較でやっぱり考えた方がいいと思うんですね。その民主主義に欠点があるっていうのはよくわかるので、そうするとそれに代替する政治体制との比較で、民主主義がいいか悪いかというのを少し検討していく必要があるだろうというふうに思います。でこれについては市原先生のレジュメでもあったその民主主義と権威主義を対比するっていうのが通常のやり方で、じゃあ何がその民主主義と権威主義が違うのかということになるとですね、通常2つぐらい挙げられてるんですね。一つはその手続きにその人々が平等な形で参加できるってこと自体がやっぱりそれが重要なんだと。その平等に参加権が与えられることでその人たちその社会の中で正当な一員だっていうふうに承認されるわけですね。それは権威主義体制が決して与えられないものだっていうのは一つです。でもう一つはそれとは違う議論なんですが、その民主主義の方が実はパフォーマンスがいいんだってこういう議論ですね。その権威主義、中国の経済が良かった時にはですね、その権威主義の方が実はいいんじゃないかってことでかなり権威主義の台頭とかですね、民主主義の失敗とかいろいろなこと言われたわけですが、しかし民主主義っていろんな人の情報を集約してくるわけですね。だからその一部の人たちが持っていない情報も持つような形でその人たちが熟議をすることで出された結果の方がその決定の方がよりパフォーマンスがいいんじゃないかってこういう可能性は多分あるんだというふうに思います。多分なので今申し上げた2つのその手続きの中に入っている価値を追求するというやり方とそのパフォーマンスを追求するこの両方をやっていく必要があると思います。ただ私の報告で強調したというか一応主張したのは デモクラシーもやっぱ限界があるんだと。デモクラシーは責任を果たすことが必ずしもできないぞっていうことを申し上げたので、その方法として、じゃあどういう形でデモクラシーを改善していくかというと、一つは、デモクラシーがより多くの人にレスポンスできるように、その中に多くの、その意思決定の中に多くの人を取り込むというやり方が一つだし、それができないような場合には、そのデモクラシーとは違う、なんかオルタナティブの機関をデモクラシーを補完するような形で、埋め込むってやり方があるんじゃないだろうかということです。それがもしかしたら、ジロード先生の構想につながってくるかもしれません。以上です。
ジロー先生、お願いします。
For your question, yes, I mean it's a difficult question, and it seems to be a recurrent question, and it points out to the gap between theory and practice. So although these arguments sound rather theoretical and a bit abstract and so forth, they have been proposed by, again, a minority of critical legal scholars in response to some trends. So there is obviously here working a dynamic between practice and theory. So in practice, if we focus our attention on litigation, which now take the form of climate litigation, but not only, it's possible to observe this move, this development, which has already happened in practice, thanks to claimants but also to their lawyers. And the way lawyers work, it's also very important. So they work in many different ways, but some of them, without being necessarily classified or labeled as activists and so forth, are quite curious about theoretical developments and quite aware about these debates ongoing in academia. And most often than not, their strategy is elaborated based on certain arguments that have been proposed by some scholars. Reciprocally, these ongoing debates, which sound a bit theoretical, again, are really rooted in the examination of what is going on in certain contexts and what are the kind of responses or attempts to evade that we can witness in against a certain context. So there is already this dynamic is already working, and it's possible to imagine another move. I mean, it's possible to imagine at this point of time to go a step further, and it's possible to realistically imagining. Again, back to climate change litigation. Climate change litigation is not a privilege. It happens in many jurisdictions, different countries. It's a global trend now. There is a very interesting database for those who have an interest in knowing more about climate change litigation, proposed by London School of Economics and Columbia School. And if you go to these databases, it's possible to really realize how much climate litigation corresponds indeed to a trend. That said, not all cases are successful. In panel one, we were discussing about unsuccessful and successful cases. It's not because there is a litigation that is necessarily a successful one, but it really indicates some developments and some movements. So it's not impossible to anticipate and indeed. Most often than not, and maybe I could, and by this remark, we as scholars have a responsibility to propose tools, to explore and to reflect critically on some trends. And I'm quite optimistic that we could witness this second development from progressive critical approach to climate justice to reparative approach to climate justice.
ありがとうございます。残りの時間、15時15分までですか。会場の皆さんから、質問を受けたいと思います。挙手をお願いします。また、質問は短く、お一人一つでお願いいたします。 どうでしょう。
日本語でお伺いします。共同通信の川北と申します。今日はどうも大変素晴らしいパネルディスカッションありがとうございました。市原先生に特にお伺いしたいんですが、今の世界がですね、渡辺先生もちょっとおっしゃいましたけども、私の見方では、19世紀型の、ヨーロッパ協調的なですね、勢力均衡の世界へどうも向かっているのではないかなというアサンプションを持ってます。で、トランプさんがなぜウクライナから手を引こうとしているのか、それからなぜグリーンランドやカナダやパナマを獲得しようとしているのか、それはもう中国と向き合うというその大きな流れの中に全てあるのかなと。で、もしこの過程が正しいとすればですね、その民主主義の価値はですね、これはこれまではグローバルドミナンスの中で冷戦後アメリカがそれを推進していったわけですけれども、米中ロの中でそのワンオブゼムになってしまうと非常に相対化されてしまって、権威主義の大国が2つ、それからアメリカが1つという中で、国内的にももちろん既存されてますし、それから国際的にもドミナンスという意味では非常に相対化されて弱まってしまうという流れの中にですね、あるのかなというふうに思ってます。で、質問は、そういった見方をシェアすることができますかと、どういうふうにお考えでしょうかということをちょっとお伺いしたいと思います。ちょっと長くなってすみません。
ありがとうございます。非常に重要なポイントだと思います。まずその現在の世界が勢力均衡の世界へと向かっているという、トランプ政権がそういった方向に向いているという可能性が一つあると私も思いますし、ただ中国に関する見方は政権の中で非常に割れているようなので、それが必ずしもそうとは言えないかもしれないという可能性もあるとは思っています。とはいえトランプ政権が中国とどう向き合ったとしても民主的な価値に関心がないことは確かであって、今後もその価値が相対化されていくということがアメリカの動きの中では見られていくだろうと思います。で、ここでしなければいけないこととして私が思っていますのはアメリカの特にトランプの動きは、その勢力均衡という、大きな絵を描いているという、ことがあったとしても、それよりも、おそらくアテンションゲッティングとそれから経済的な利益、この2つが、モチベーションとして一番大きいのではないかと思っています。でそれを考えたときに、トランプ政権が取る一つ一つの小さな動き、特に民主的な価値を毀損するような動きですけれども、これらの一つ一つに過剰反応しないことというのがまず重要なのではないかと思っています。で他方それに加えて、アメリカ以外の国々がこの価値をどの程度守っていけるかということが重要なわけですが、ここで非常に難しいのは実は特に中国ですけれども、この中国が民主主義の価値というものを我々が体現しているという言説をここ特に2年ぐらい強めています。それですので放っておくとその言説に民主主義の概念が実は乗っ取られてしまう可能性があって、でそうすると自由主義という側面を完全に排除してしまった民主主義の理解というものが国際的にさらに一人歩きしてしまう可能性があると思います。それですのでリベラリズムにフォーカスを当てたナラティブ作りというものは諦めずに行っていく必要があると思っています。
ありがとうございます。では、後ろの若い方。
はい、入りました。今日はありがとうございます。慶応大学の研究員をしております岩田と申します。国民主権の社会において主権者が 主権者として意思表示ができているのかっていう問題があるかと思いました。今日滝川さんの中の投票権という表記がありましたけども、投票以外の方法でその意思表示をするってことが実はその民主主義社会の柱ではないかと思いますけども、今のその世論調査とかだと結構適当に回答ができたりする。もっと言うとその人々の認知ギャップがものすごく大きい中で、じゃあ主権者が主権者として意思表示ができているのか、またはできる方法があるのかという点について皆様のご意見を伺えればと思いました。
ありがとうございます。時間も質問もたくさん手が挙がってますので、滝川先生お願いします。
ご質問ありがとうございます。国民主権の下で国民の意思表示ができているのかと。これはおそらく権威主義体制と比べるのがいいと、基本的に比較で考えた方がいいと思いますので、その権威主義体制と比べると、民主主義体制の国においては、国民は明らかに意思表示ができていると。それが十分かどうかっていうのは、これはいろんな議論の余地があると思いますが、しかしトランプでさえ選挙に勝ってきてるわけなので、民主的な意思に支えられているというふうに、デモクラシーは捉えるべきだというふうに私は理解しています。で、もう一つだけよろしいですかね。主権って概念が実はちょっと面白い話がありまして、今日将来世代の話をしました。でそれについてその世代主権っていう考え方を導入すべきだっていう意見があるわけですね。それはどういう話かっていうと、各世代は主権者だ、その世代の主権者であって、別の世代に対してその世代がその影響を及ぼすというのは別の世代に対する主権侵害だって、こういうふうに捉えるべきだって、こういう考え方です。だから主権って考え方は、もしかしたらそれをその空間だけじゃなくて時間にも拡張するとですね、この現在世代が将来世代の主権を侵害しているって、こういう語り口を共有するようなものになるかもしれません。でそういう語り口が本当にいいのかどうかっていうのは検討の力があると思いますが、今の国民主権の話とも多分関わってくる話だとは思います。
ありがとうございます。他にいかがでしょうか。じゃあ、赤いセーターの女性。
滝川先生にご質問があります。パネル1で発表しました高江と申します。先生のご発表で取り上げられた影響原理の代表例としては、功利主義なんかが挙げられるのではないかと思います。で、恣意的な線引きを徹底して排除するという点にその特徴が現れているかなというふうに思いまして、例えば先生のスライドにありました外国人の参政権の話だったり、自国民と外国人っていう線引きですね、それは。で、あとは子どもと大人、成人未成年の線引きっていうのがあって、でこれはその影響原理をそのまま適用すると、こういった線引きを撤廃していく動きにつながるっていうことになるかと思います。でこれは例えばその功利主義者であるピーター・シンガーによる種差別の議論なんかとも類似するなと思って伺っていました。でこのように考えるとこういった線引きの撤廃って奇妙奇天烈な気もするんですが、ただ一方で私たちはまさにそういった線引きを疑問視して撤廃することで倫理的な拡張もしてきたと思うんですね。それは女性とか男性、白人、有色人種で、このように考えると恣意的な線引きの排除の動きを一概に棄却することはできないのではないか、少なくとも線引きの倫理的正当性っていうのは自明ではないというふうに思うんですけども、この点について例えば倫理的な線引きと政治的な線引きの相違、あるいは民主主義との関連などを踏まえながら先生のご意見を伺いたいということと、あと未来世代の選考の不確定性という点で時間的限界を超えられないということだったんですが、例えば共通の選考や価値を想定することっていうのは可能だとは思うんですね。で例えば最近注目されている長期主義なんかはその限界を超えていこうとする試みだと思うんですが、これについてもちょっと可能であればお伺いしたいです。
ありがとうございます。貴重なご意見、ご質問だと思います。で、一つ目のその教会の問題ですね。教会について私はかなり多分関心を持って研究はしてきているんですが、その教会って私たちは自明のこととして引いてるわけです。で、しかし問い返してみると、本当この教会って根拠があるんだろうかというのは、やっぱり問い返される必要があるだろうというふうには思っています。でしかしですね、私の報告で前提にしている境界っていうのが一つありまして、それは何かというと、人間と非人間はやっぱ境界線があるんだって、こういう発想なんですね。だから私がデモスの範囲に含めるべきだって考えるのは、影響原理からそれ含めるべきだと考えるのは、外国人であったり将来、子供であったりするけれども、動物であったり自然だったりはしないわけですね。で今日のこのレスポンシビリティの話と絡めて言うとですね、これはジロド先生や高井先生にもお伺いしたいんですが、 この話を聞いていると、人間に対する責任以外の責任を認めようとしていらっしゃるように聞こえるんですね。つまり、その環境に対する責任。私は環境に対する責任っていうのは突き詰めると、それは結局人間に対する、あるこの環境によって被害を受けるその他国の人の責任であったり、将来世代の責任であったり、人間に対する責任だっていうふうに考えてるんですが、環境それ自体に対する責任であるとか、地球それ自体に対する責任っていうものを何か前提にされた議論をしているように私には聞こえるんですね。そこでは何か大きなギャップがあると思うんですが、それについて何かジロド先生やなんか反対質問するみたいで申し訳ないんですが、高井さん何かありましたらお願いいたした。
そうしましたら時間もあります。ジロー先生いかがでしょう。
To answer very clearly, maybe we could make here a connection with panel 1 and this emphasis and actually ongoing discussion among scholars on the relation approach to a regulation, environmental approach to law more broadly and more specifically to environmental law. It depends really on how we conceive of these relations. Most of the time we conceive relations in terms of interrelations, interdependency, and maybe this understanding of these ongoing discussions has an extension of responsibility without borders, without any limits. But if we try to understand a little the relational approach in slightly different terms, not conceiving of relations in terms of interdependency, but maybe in terms of intra-relations and what it means and implies based on a slightly wider range of theoretical arguments compared to we have no time to engage with these ongoing discussions on neo-materialism and so forth, which provide more radical in a way, but more intellectually also stimulating understandings of relational approach and this notion of relation, which could be at the basis of this responsibility that we try to envision or re-envision. So maybe I would like to discuss a bit more about those who are interested, a bit more about the possibility to rework the definition of relation, the way we conceive of relations in the Anthropocene, adopting slightly, if not a more radical, maybe a more disturbing understanding of relations in terms of intra-relations. And then what does it mean really in terms of institutional design and institutional reforms? Of course, I have absolutely no answer, but maybe it could help refine a little bit this understanding of, okay, everybody now is responsible of everything and reciprocally. And maybe a final word, and it's not really concrete, but during panel 1, one panelist briefly mentioned about this notion of assemblaging, and geographers are very strong in relying on this. I think that there is also some potential here, and it could be quite interesting to rethink about these institutional designs and attempts to reform in terms of reassemblaging. But then what do we reassemblage? And it's not entities individually defined or strictly neatly bounded, but again, it's assemblages based on an understanding of what intra-relations means and what would such an understanding imply in terms of institutional design and legal reforms.
ありがとうございます。later. You have time at the end of the day. 手短に残り3分ぐらいあるので、一つずつちょっと1分ぐらいでちょっとお答えいただきたいんですけど、市原先生、よく正しい戦争っていうのがあるかどうかっていうね、議論があって、聖戦論のような形なんですけど、民主的な戦争っていうのはあり得るのかっていうね、ことですね。それから、滝川先生なんですけど、今までの人類史、アリストクラシーとか、あるいはオリガルヒみたいなね、概念っていうのがあって、その中でデモクラシーっていうのもあるんですけど、先ほどおっしゃったその影響 原理を踏まえた上で、何かこのデモクラシーという概念をこうさらに一歩先に行くようなね、新しい概念というのが模索されているのかどうかっていうことをちょっとお伺いしたいと思います。それからジロド先生なんですけども、滝川先生は教会っていう言葉をお話しされましたけども、パネル1からずっと聞いてて面白かったのは、その人新世という言葉が2000年ぐらいに生まれたっていうことですね。で、おそらく人間が地球においてかなりドミナントな勢力になってきたっていうのは別に2000年に始まったことではなくて、もっとその前から始まってるわけですけど、なぜ2000年の頃に人新世っていう概念を誰が何のために何の目的で作り上げたのかっていうね、その人新世っていうのは本当に純粋な科学的な概念なのか、それともポリティカルイデオロギーなのかね。冷戦も終わって、行き場を失った左派が作り上げた言葉なのかもしれないしね、なんかどういうふうにこれを位置づければいいかということをちょっとお伺いできますか。
ありがとうございます。ものすごく難しい面白い、ポイントですが、民主主義国が他の民主主義国からの、応援を求めるときに、やはり民主的な戦争というものを戦おうと、苦労して、いるということは間違いないと思います。例えばウクライナの場合ですと、それまで腐敗というものが非常にウクライナの中で問題だったわけですけれども、汚職の問題をできるだけ解決していくということをこの戦争をやっている間も常に動いています。ただ、ウクライナの場合に、ウクライナのみではないですけれども、他方で例えば親ロシア的な政党ができては困るので、そういった政党を禁止したり、あるいはニュース配信に関しても大本営発表に基本的なニュースは統一されているというようなことがありますので、そこのところはやはり民主的ではないと言わざるを得ないかと思います。また例えばミャンマーの民主派のように民主的な正当性を主張することで民主主義国からサポートを得ようとする例もありますけれども、その民主派のアクターの間で意見の違いが非常に強く出てしまって、そこでリーダーシップを誰が取るのかということで問題になったりもしています。
はい、デモクラシーの先を行く概念、制度はないかということで、非常に難しいご質問なんですが、私自身はそのデモクラシーを研究していると、デモクラシーはやっぱりかなり優れた制度だというふうには感じます。ただ、その問題となるのはですね、そのデモクラシーにもいろんなバリエーションがあるんですね。で、デモクラシーにいろんなバリエーションがあって、例えば、デモクラシーにいろんな問題があるのは多分間違いないことで、そのバリエーションの中でもその代表を今のような形で選んでていいのかとか、その権力分離っていうのとどうミックスするのかとか、いろいろな問題があると思います。なので、そのデモクラシーの中のバリエーションを区分けした上で、しかもそのデモクラシーだけではその限界があるというのは今日のメッセージ、一つのメッセージですので、そのデモクラシーを補完するような制度ですね。それは何なのか、例えば法の支配なのか、あるいは何ですかね、他の、立憲主義かもしれませんし、あるいは市原先生のご報告の中であったものだとすると、その価値とかですね、その観光とか、そういった、あるいはバーチューってものかもしれません。そういったものに補完されながら、そのデモクラシーを少しずつ改良していくっていうのが、我々ができることなんだろうというふうには思います。
Your question was about Gilles CAMPAGNOLO, and I mean, yes, we definitely need to first ask from the critical perspective whether where does this concept come from and for what reasons it became so popular. There are many reasons, and already a number of critiques have been addressed to the limitations of this concept. If not its origins and so forth. There are many Anthropocenes, in fact. So it has been initially reproposed by Sturmer and I just forgot his name now. Crutzen, but it's not really new. It has been discussed already in France in 19th century and 20th century. So it has been just re-invoked by Crutzen for certain reasons, for sure. And Crutzen embraced a positive vision of the Anthropocene. Actually, he passed away years ago, but he was very faithful in technological fixes. And he was convinced that it was possible to fix the Anthropocene challenges based on technological innovation and so forth. So it corresponds to a discourse that is yeah, that is marked in that sense. At the same time, from there, we witnessed the development of many other narratives addressing the Anthropocene, and it directly told to environmentalists, legal scholars, because it just provided them a golden opportunity to reflect from the most critical perspective on their own field of knowledge and study. And then they're quite far away from probably what Crutzen and colleagues and Earth system scientists initially thought when reactivating the Anthropocene as a narrative. So now we could speak in terms of Anthropocenes using the plural.
ありがとうございます。ちょっと時間を4分ほど超過しましたけど、それは一重に私の責任があるので、責任ある行動とは何かを考えるっていうタイトルからちょっと矛盾してるんですけれども、時間になりましたので、パネル2をここで終わりたいと思います。パネリストの皆さん、ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。最後にカンパニョーロ先生から、まとめの方を総括をお願いしたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
The name. Well, thank you to all the panelists, for the audience as well, and online audience too. You know, one strategy, Sakuryaku kana, of the present situation in the world, we've been talking about America, Shugoku, etc., right? Is that when there is a talk, you change the topic, you put your own topic there, and you pump the air out of the room. That was actually systematized and explicitly stated by the present president of the United States. Pump the oxygen out of the room and change the topic. So we spoke about America. Europa to書いてありますね. We spoke about democracy. 責任が書いてありますね. I think that the translators should be really thanked for the difficult trouble and work that they had to do. It is quite interesting if we think of the word responsibility in English, sekinin. Response, ability, capacity to answer. Capacity to answer to what? What to answer to the kind of strategy that I just mentioned? Someone is changing the topic. Who can answer? If you do the same thing, you're stuck because you play the game of the one who has changed the rules without telling you. So what you do is that you come back to the origins. The origins of the topics and the concepts that we've been listening and talking about are in Europe. Democracy, demos, has been mentioned many times. That's Greek. If America today is like Rome in the ancient world, then Europe is like Greece. All the concepts that the Romans used were basically created by the Greeks. We Europeans have been opening the world and many topics, and today in panel 1 and panel 2, we've had many corresponding elements. Actually, the question that I wanted to ask to Takikawa sensei was more a remark, saying that the question was asked about the non-national, non-citizens' possibility to vote. And it was mentioned that all citizens in the world actually have something to do with the President of the United States, even if they are not American citizens. In France, there has been a long discussion about who can vote. Who is responsible for electing the mayor of the city, Chiakusho? Who will be the new Shicho? Who will be the one for city level, for local government level, for regional government level? And actually, we decided through many talks that at least for some elections, not the presidential elections, but for the other local governmental elections, it is possible to have foreigners voting if they are Europeans. But that's already something. So that was the possibility to have an answer. Because once again, if you play the game of the one who is pumping the air out of the room, you get nowhere. What you have to do is to come back to the origins of the talk, of the topic, or whatever, and try to understand what it is about. Responsibility. No anger, no surprise. This is useless. The point is to understand how the topics relate, and actually they do a lot. Because we've been talking about spatial dimensions. I was talking, Takikawa sensei, it's what is the nation? Of course, for Japan as an island, it has a long history, it is very special in a way. But look at the situation in Europe. As I said, foreigners can vote in local elections, but the discussion has been that they will not vote for the presidential elections. But all over Europe, European citizens vote for the European elections. Still, Europe is not one country. So actually, the question of the boundaries is very important. And this is about space. And the first talk by Raphaël Languillon in panel 1 was a geographer's talk. It was about space. The limits of what is human, who is human or not, appear very clearly in the talk by Takai sensei and also by Giraudoux sensei here. They are related and they make the issue larger, calling to diversity topics that Marie-Elif put forth, and that in a way with the issue of war, Ichihara sensei also put forth, because you do war against those that you disqualify as humans in order to be able to kill them in mass. So the two panels being thus related, I don't have much to say in the end as concluding words, but I will just come back to my introduction in a sense, not only about corporate social responsibility, but something I noticed since I was at the Sorbonne for 2 years now. I couldn't see it when I was back in Japan, but this time I saw it. This is not money for translators. I am sorry. I would like to offer you a good dinner. You need it, and you deserve it. On the old one, Fukuzawa Yukichi. On the new one, Shibuzawa Eiichi. Notice, no Seijika. It's not about politicians. It's about a scholar, Gakumono Susume, etc. We all know about that. And that's the beginning of what happened in your country, conceptually. And an entrepreneur, a businessman, coming from a family of farmers. That is, those people are acting responsibly when they create new ways of thinking, making the country able to modernize in the mind, and then the reality. Yeah, because with the bank, postal service, whatever, you know well, and I watched the Asa drama. Otherwise, I wouldn't know. Those are the ones who bring responsibility when the big names pump the air out of the room. And this is why we have to come back to the origins. Once again, the origins of many of the concepts that we've been talking about are by us in Europe. But we are aware that in this large world, all civilizations, like your civilizations, have brought some of the concepts that we can now transfer each other. It was said by Adrienne, and she wrote this paper that I mentioned with us very nicely, Jijo, Kyojo, Kojo. Well, those things are coming from your contribution. We don't need to talk about the states all the time. We need to talk about who we are. We are Europeans with ideas dating back to the Greeks. And you are Japanese with ideas that we can learn from, that we can exchange. The time when there was some superiority on the one end, you know, Westerners, sometimes they have felt we are bringing all the things to the other people because they don't know, yeah? And so we can make colonies. And other white men came to the rest of the world and were surprised and amazed by such a rich civilization like yours, like China, etc. So you have this feeling of awe on the one hand, or this feeling of paternalism on the other hand. Neither of that is possible today. What we can do is what we did with two panels, Japanese, Europeans, in this case French, who can exchange and make to each other fruitful talks and fruitful ideas, like discussing this concept from the point of view of space, from the point of view of diversity of approaches and the boundaries of it. Those are the concepts that we choose to talk about, not just repeating what the people who pump the air out of the room want us to do. We are better than that. That's why we're thinkers. And therefore, this is the point that I want to make last, is to thank again NERA for making that possible, for making that talk possible, for making that exchange of views possible with people of the press, with other scholars, and with the large public, because what we talk about usually in our universities often remains within the universities. It is worth getting more than that. And to finish, I will just remind the questions that emerged during the two panels. If you want to do something for the environment, etc., the idea of planning with responsibility comes naturally in. But then you have to think twice and say, who plans for whom in that case? If you want to discuss the rights of the different entities, other machines, animals, parks, rivers come to mind. And you have to ask, second reflection, who ascribes the rights to whom or to what? As the title of Takikawa Sensei's presentation was, responsibility to whom? And as it was said in different talks, and especially in the last one by Jiro Sensei, who is affected by climate change, by loss of biodiversity, by etc.? Who is affected? Who is always in the end a single person, an individual? Yourself, myself. And it is through the exchange between these individuals that maybe we can try to think and get ideas more clear, just to leave the people who pump the air out of the room, just to leave them out of the room. That's where they belong. I thank you for your attention, and I'm glad to have those concluding words for this very, very nice opportunity of a conference. Thanks to our promoter, NERA, once again. Thank you.